Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening. This video, also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. I should have never brought my dead fiancé back to life. It smelled of rain that afternoon, the kind that lingers on old stones. I was standing there in Greenwood Cemetery, in Brooklyn, in front of Nathan's grave, just staring at the wet dirt. It had been 2 weeks since the accident. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my heart and left a gaping wound behind. I didn't know what I was expecting from being there, but I had nowhere else to go. That's when I saw him. A man in a long, dark coat, standing just far enough away that I didn't notice him at first. He wasn't visiting anyone, just standing, watching. He had this air about him, something unsettling but not dangerous, at least not immediately. He walked over to me, his eyes deep and unreadable. "You loved him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I didn't answer, didn't need to. "What if I told you there's a way to bring him back?" I laughed, the first since time Nathan died. "There's no bringing him back," I said, wiping my face. "He's dead." He shook his head slowly, a grin creeping across his face. "Not all dead stay dead." The way he said it sent a chill through me. I should have walked away right then, but grief does things to you. He told me about a Kabbalistic ritual, one that could pull a soul from beyond. Bring him back. I should have known there was a catch, but I didn't care. I didn't ask enough questions. That night, I did it. I went back to Nathan's grave, the air thick with mist, the cemetery eerily quiet. I followed his instructions, candles, Hebrew prayers, and offering of blood. My blood. I pricked my finger, let it drip onto the earth, and begged. I begged Nathan to come back. I begged God. I begged anyone who would listen. At first, nothing happened, just the wind, a distant siren, and my own ragged breathing. But then I heard it, a whisper. It started low, unintelligible, but then clearer. A name. My name. I turned and there he was. Nathan. He was standing at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the candlelight. My heart nearly exploded. He looked almost like himself. His hair was tousled, his eyes that same warm brown, but something was off. The way he moved, slow, stiff, like a puppet on strings. "Sarah," he said, but his voice wasn't right. It was too deep, too broken. I ran to him, tears streaming down my face, but when I touched him, his skin was cold, like ice. And his smile, it wasn't Nathan's. It was a grin, too wide, too sharp. The man in the coat hadn't brought Nathan back. He'd let something else in. Something darker. Something hungry. The thing that wore my fiancé's face pulled me close, its breath cold against my ear, whispering in a voice that wasn't his. "You summoned me, and I'm never leaving you." I screamed, but no one could hear. "We leave one nightmare behind, but the next waits patiently for you. No exit 202. I used to be a trucker. Was for about 10 years, I think. I don't do driving anymore. Try to limit as much as I can, even outside of work. Now, I don't have a fear of driving. I have a fear of destinations. Every time you get into a car, you have a destination in mind, a place you want to go. Even if you don't have a specific place in mind, that place is just a way. The saying, it's about the journey, not the destination? Bullshit. When is the car ride to your vacation spot the fun part of the trip? Never. Usually just awkwardly quiet. That's besides the point, though. What I hate the most, though, is driving through the Midwest. I swear, every single one of those towns is just the same. Identical. Cookie cutter. Gas station, few neighborhoods, corner store. Once you've seen one, you've seen them all. It's midsummer. I've been going through miles and miles of just cornfields, as far as the eye can see. Flat fields of corn. Oddly beautiful during the day, like a sea of green spreading out there. During the night, though, you can only imagine what might be hiding in those corn stalks. As a trucker, you have to remain vigilant. If something, or for some God-forsaken reason, someone, were to dart out, I wouldn't be able to stop. Just don't like the fields at night. I'm on Route 23, somewhere between Iowa and Nebraska, and it's getting dark. When it gets dark in the Midwest, all you have is the lights on your truck and the light of the moon. Here's something you might not know. The majority of large truck crashes happen in rural areas. I personally have had some of my closest calls in rural areas. Just nothing for miles, not even a turn in the road, and your brain basically just starts to turn off, go on autopilot. Never a good thing when your mind starts to wander while operating a 30-ton killing machine. So when I start to get tired, I start to look for a place to rest for the night. That's what I was doing when I stumbled across exit 202. I had driven down this route a good few times before, but this exit was new to me. I just figured there might have been some new development since the last time I had been down the route. I was curious, tired, and hungry, so I took the exit and headed down the road. Corn. That's all I can say, corn. This road was narrow, a struggle to stay in my lane as the highway ended and gave way to a mostly neglected road, unkempt and rough. Looking into the distance, there was nothing. No lights, no buildings, not even another car on the road. Just corn. So much corn. Then that's when I saw it. A small clearing on the side of the road with a large neon pink sign beckoning me closer. Mabel's Diner. Getting closer, it looked like it was on its last legs. The light was dim, flickering in the night. From what I could see from the safety of my truck, the diner looked rusted and near decrepit. Although an open sign and lights within, with nowhere else to go, I hopped out of my truck and entered the building. As I entered, a weak-sounding bell heralded my entry. The place was nearly empty, with a few patrons who barely even looked up from their plates as I walked in. The waitress behind the counter looked at me with a dull gaze. This poor woman seemed exhausted, as if she had been working here as long as the building had been. Her name tag was only more proof of this, reading Mabel. I just asked for the house special, and she served me some pretty basic eggs and sausage with a tired smile. My nose began to sniffle. I've always had allergies. Something about this place, though, was especially bad. Like stuck in a hayloft bad. My nose just would not stop leaking, my eyes were starting to water, and I was severely starting to regret not taking my allergy medicine earlier. As I ate, my mind began to wander. The food was just forgettable. It was sustaining, but utterly unfulfilling. Makes sense why the place looked so worn down. Who would come all the way out here for this? That's when a big feeling of unease began to creep into my chest. The place was silent. Not a single noise. There's always noise no matter where you go. Scraping of utensils on plates, quiet murmuring, hell, even the humming of lights or even a fly buzzing past. The place was just utterly silent. I quickly paid for my meal, throwing down a wad of cash as I left, leaving all of the disheveled patrons behind me. I walked out into that pitch-black parking lot and came to a terrible realization. The parking lot was empty. Not a single vehicle was out there, including my truck. It was gone. I was stranded in this horrible place. I pulled out my phone, tried calling my boss, and of course, because I'm in the middle of nowhere, no signal and no escape. I heard a faint jingle of a bell opening and a cold voice cutting through my chest. "Mabel," she said to me. "Oh dear, your truck gone? Come on in, stay a while, we'll call someone for you." She stood so still in the doorframe, a silhouette dimly lit by the dingy light behind her. When people stand still, they still move. Their chest rises and falls as they breathe. Maybe a drum of their fingers against their leg. A small shifting back and forth in their stance. But she was deathly still, like a mannequin. It wasn't just that, but her voice just sounded wrong, flat, hollow. I was filled with a sense of dread, like if I followed along with her, I would not be leaving that diner. So I slowly turned around and began walking back the way I came. Maybe if I made it back to the highway, I could hail someone down and get to a place to fill in my boss and figure out what to do about my truck. And I walked. And I walked, and I walked, and I walked. Corn all around me, so utterly alone. It was dark, no lights, no nothing, just the rustling of corn and the moonlight to guide me. Then I heard that piercing voice again. "Stay a while, we'll keep you company." I spun around, and there she stood, standing in the road, deathly still. Stay a while. The corn to my sides shifted as some of the patrons of the bar slowly made their way out. Now looking closer, I came to a terrible realization. The reason they were silent, the reason they didn't even seem to breathe. In the glimmer of the moonlight as they approached me, I saw what they really were. Their skin was stretched tight, more of a mask than their own flesh. Peeking from underneath the seams of their skin, around their neck, was straw, poking out from between the stitches that held them together. They grabbed me, holding on to me with a strength I had never felt before. Mabel just got closer and closer to me. I trashed against their grip, screaming and crying against the men who were holding me back. Mabel only got closer, her cold, dead eyes staring into me. "Stay a while." Her hand stretched out, touching my neck, an icy stillness spreading through my body. Adrenaline is one hell of a drug. I kicked her right in the stomach with all of my strength. It was like kicking a brick wall. She stumbled back, looking more confused than shocked. The men's grip on my loosened just barely enough, and I broke loose, running as fast as I could for the highway. My heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through, letting me push past the ache and pain of my joints and my ragged gasping for air. I kept running and running past the burn of my lungs and the tightness of my throat. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms, screaming until my voice gave out and he stopped for me. I explained my situation, that someone was trying to kill me. He let me into his car and started driving to a nearby town. Toward the diner, I began to panic, to tell him to turn around to the highway, that the people who attacked me were this way. And he looked at me confused, that the highway was nowhere nearby, that there was no Mabel's diner, that there was no exit 202. A feeling of pure fear flooded me. We drove for a while, and as I saw the lights of the town in the distance, the man was right. There were no signs of my assailants. There were no signs of the diner, no signs of my truck. The cornfields ended, and I was greeted by a small Midwestern town. The man dropped me off at the local police station, and I gave them my statement. I called my boss about the situation, and they sent someone in the area to swing by and bring me back home. When I got back and tried reporting my truck and all its details, they gave me the most confusing revelation yet. My truck was still in the garage. Only when I went to check on it, it wasn't the same truck. Different license plate, the color was a different shade, and the keys in my pocket did not work on this one. I brought it up to my supervisor, and he looked just as confused as I did. The keys didn't go to any truck in the garage, or any on the record ever. I still have the keys now, not sure what to do with them. I quit pretty soon after. Not a big fan of leaving my town, much less the state, especially those cornfields. God, I hate those cornfields. I'm just trying to separate from it all. I'm worried that this might be a curse for me, because on the highway to get my groceries today, I saw an exit 143. And despite all the information I look for it online, there is no exit 143. But if you thought that was chilling, our next story will take you even deeper into the darkness. My days as a radio jockey, I've been working the night shift at this small-town radio station for the better part of 3 years. My show Night Vibes wasn't exactly primetime radio, but it paid the bills, and I got to talk about whatever the hell I wanted. Insomniacs, long-haul truckers, and the occasional stoner called in to chat about their weird theories or play requests. Most nights, it was the same old thing, until the night Daniel called, and that call changed my life forever. It was close to midnight. The phone lines had been quiet for a while, and I was halfway through sipping my coffee when the line lit up. I hit the button, leaned into the mic, and put on my usual cheery DJ voice. "Night Vibes, you're on the air. Who's this?" "Mark, I'm calling from the future." I heard a voice blare from the other end of the line. I immediately rolled my eyes and leaned back in my chair. Not another prank call, I sighed to myself. Or worse, this could be a conspiracy nut. I was about to hang up when the voice continued speaking. "Tomorrow morning at 7:42, there will be a crash on Highway 4. A delivery truck will turn turtle. No one will die, but it'll cause a pile-up and lead to a ton of traffic on the highway stretching back miles." "Sure," I said, smirking into the microphone. "You've got my attention, buddy. What's next? An alien invasion? Somebody winning the lottery? Or maybe even a zombie apocalypse?" The voice on the other end didn't flinch. In fact, he stayed silent for so long that I thought the line had gone dead. Then his voice cut across the static, more resolute this time, carrying an edge of certainty that chilled me. "Check the news in the morning, Mark. You'll see I'm telling the truth." But the next morning was different. I woke up late, groggy from the long shift, and checked my phone like I always did, scanning the latest headlines. My eyes stopped at one in particular. Delivery truck causes massive accident on Highway 4, no fatalities. The timestamp read 7:42 a.m. My stomach dropped, and a shiver crawled up my spine. My hand trembled as I stared at the screen, unable to fully process what had just happened. This couldn't be real, but it was, exactly as Daniel had warned. The accident, the time, the location, every detail matched. For the first time I felt it, that creeping unease, like the world had shifted slightly off balance. I spent the rest of the day turning the call over in my head, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. People predict things all the time, right? I asked myself, but deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just a lucky guess. I tried to chalk it up to mishearing the time or imagining the entire thing, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. When I returned to work that evening, I couldn't help but wonder, would Daniel call again? Part of me hoped he wouldn't, but part of me needed to know. As I began my shift, I clicked to take the first call. Night vibes, you're on the air. A familiar voice crackled through the line. It's Daniel, he said, calm and matter-of-fact. There's going to be a fire tomorrow, in the basement of St. Mary's Hospital. No one will be hurt, but they won't find out what caused it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine once again. This time there was no mocking reply, no sarcastic comeback from me. I was shaken, and Daniel could hear it in my silence. He did not laugh, nor did he gloat about getting it right the previous night. He had simply moved on to his next prediction, and that made me panic even the more. Don't bother warning them, he added. They won't believe you. In fact, nobody will believe you. They never do. What the hell do you want? I asked suddenly, my voice more aggressive than I had intended. You'll see, he said in a matter-of-fact manner. I'll call again tomorrow. Click. He disconnected the call and was gone, leaving me speechless for the second time in 2 days. This was getting very frustrating and also made me very anxious at the same time. I considered calling the police, but what if they thought I was involved? If the fire happened just like Daniel said, I could easily be pegged as the culprit. But since he insisted no one would be hurt, I decided to wait, to see if his prediction was real. The following morning, the news confirmed it. A fire had broken out in the basement of St. Mary's Hospital. Just like he said, no one was hurt, and the cause remained unknown. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't. It was too real. Paranoia crept in, making me feel like someone was watching me, like I was being manipulated in some twisted game. But this time I knew he would call again. In fact, I was certain of it. So when the third call eventually came in, I was already dreading it. Tomorrow evening, Mark, at 7:34. A shootout will happen at Riley's supermarket. One person will die from a bullet wound. I clenched my fists as my heart started racing uncontrollably. Why are you telling me this? Are you doing this all by yourself? Are you making these things happen? Are you so starved for attention? I asked, almost yelling into the microphone. No, Mark. I'm just telling you what I know, Daniel replied in a calm voice. You're full of shit, I snapped, slamming my hand down on the desk. If you can predict this, why not stop it? Why not prevent people from getting hurt? There was a pause, then the voice came back, quieter this time. It's not about stopping anything, Mark. It's about what happens after. What does that even mean? I asked, leaning into the microphone. What will happen later? But to my growing frustration, Daniel had already disconnected the call. That night, I realized I could no longer keep quiet. I called the police, told them about the shooting and the location. They thought I was crazy, but after some convincing, they agreed to station a patrol car nearby, just in case. But I later learned I was in for more disappointment. The shooting had happened despite the police presence. The footage showed a body being carried out on a stretcher, loaded into an ambulance. My heart sank. I didn't go into work the next night. I couldn't. Daniel's phone calls were gnawing at me, and I felt like a pawn in his twisted little game. Sleep was impossible. His voice kept replaying in my head. It's about what happens after. I didn't want to know what came after. As I sat there in the dark, my thoughts spinning, my phone suddenly rang. The display flashed an unknown number. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but I answered. It was Daniel. I thought you quit, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Tell me what you want, I whispered, barely holding myself together. What happens after? You'll find out soon enough, Mark. We're getting close now. I'll call again tomorrow. But this time, it'll be for you, so you need to be in your office for this." The line went dead, and I was left in a cold sweat. What did he mean by "for me"? This wasn't just about some event I'd hear about on the news anymore. This was different. This felt personal. I spent the entire morning pacing my apartment, chain-smoking, and staring at the clock. Each time I glanced at the phone, I half expected it to ring, Daniel's voice slipping through the static. By nightfall, I had made my decision. I had to go to the station. Hiding wouldn't make a difference, and something deep inside told me Daniel wanted me there. But I was in for more surprises. When I arrived at the parking garage, I was shocked to find my car missing. It had vanished without a trace, and I couldn't fathom how. My heart raced as I noticed a strange figure peering at me from behind one of the concrete pillars. I caught only a glimpse, but it sent me into a panic, and I began running towards the exit. I ran all the way to my office, relief washing over me only after I finally locked the door behind me and sank into my chair. The familiar hum of the studio provided comfort, but it was short-lived. A couple of minutes later, the phone began to ring. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. This was it. Whatever Daniel wanted, it was about to happen. Swallowing hard, I finally picked up the phone. "Mark?" His voice crackled through the line. "I told you I'd call. Are you ready?" "Yes," I replied after a moment's pause, determined to see this through. "Very well," Daniel said, his voice cold and detached. I heard a sound, like fingers snapping. Suddenly, the TV in my studio flickered on, and my jaw dropped when I saw video footage myself sitting alone in my car, parked across from Riley's supermarket. A police car was stationed just some feet ahead of me. I realized I was staking out the place, waiting for something. Beads of sweat dripped down my forehead as two figures, dressed in black and wearing masks, approached the supermarket entrance. They were heavily armed. In an instant, the police jumped out of their vehicles, guns raised, and gunfire erupted. The masked men sprayed bullets indiscriminately from their automatic weapons, and I watched in horror as one of the stray bullets slammed into my chest while I sat helpless in the car. I gasped, feeling a sharp, phantom pain as I saw myself slump forward, blood soaking through my shirt. The police eventually overpowered the gunmen, arresting them, but it didn't matter. I watched in disbelief as my consciousness faded. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the car anymore. I stood next to a stretcher where my lifeless body lay with a white sheet pulled over my face. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance while a couple of policemen towed away my car, leaving the street eerily silent. I stood in the middle of the road, looking around in confusion. What had just happened? Then I saw him, a figure standing a few feet away. He had also been in the parking lot earlier, but now I could see him clearly. He had a human shape, but he wasn't human. His form shifted and blurred, like a mass of gray fog twisting into something both familiar and utterly alien. As I watched the TV sitting in my studio, horror gripped me as the visuals continued to unfold. I saw myself, panic-stricken, running after catching sight of the strange-looking figure. Then, the scene abruptly shifted to a cemetery, where my family gathered around my grave, performing my final rites. I watched helplessly as my body was lowered into the ground, while I was standing next to family members and friends, completely invisible to them. Suddenly, the screen flickered again, showing me waking up in my own apartment. The TV replayed the entire day's events, me discovering my car missing, spotting the gray figure in the parking lot, and my frantic run back to the office. With that, the screen suddenly went blank and the TV turned off on its own, leaving me in unsettling silence. Am I already dead? I finally asked, my voice trembling, tears streaming down my face. Yes, came the calm reply. I sat there, trying to process the truth, but before I could gather my thoughts, the phone abruptly went dead. That's when I saw it, right there in the studio. The same gray mass appeared before me. Who are you? I stammered, jerking back in my chair, fear taking hold. I am Death, Mark. I'm here to show you what comes after. What could possibly come after this? I asked, my voice heavy with lament. I want you to continue your job as a radio jockey, Mark, the figure replied, its voice chillingly steady. I want you to be a medium for the voices that need to be heard. Use this opportunity. Are you kidding me? I shot back, desperation creeping into my tone. Who will listen to me now? The figure didn't waver. Go open the door and see for yourself. With hesitation, I stood and opened the door. My breath caught in my throat as I saw them. Hundreds of gray, spectral beings hovering in the air, their eyes locked on me, watching. So, Death spoke again, his voice echoing through the air. What will you do, Mark? Will you do what is required of you? I looked back at him, fear filling my gaze as I stood at the edge of a difficult decision. As one nightmare fades, another begins to stir in the shadows. My dorm insists we are in bed by 11 p.m. A few weeks into my sophomore year, I could already tell this was a waste of time. It couldn't get more mundane. That tiny dorm building only housed 23 students, and all my life revolved around were classes and study sessions. I would be lucky if I even had time to hang out with a friend. The midterms were approaching, which meant I barely had human interactions at all. With strict staff and days that just blend together, I was already counting down the day I get out of here. For the most part, I had no interest in getting into trouble. Every night, I abided by the 11 p.m. curfew like clockwork, sliding into bed by 10:30 p.m. and trying my best to make the day end as soon as possible. After all, every 5 minutes starting from 10:30 p.m. until 10:45 p.m., the dorm speakers echo a robotic voice saying, "Stay in bed." As far as I know, it happened every single night without fail. No one questioned it. All students made sure to follow the clear orders. In any case, no one was interested in getting an earful. After so long, though, I still couldn't tell if a staff member bothered to repeat those directions, or if it was just a lazy recording. As the early days of autumn rolled in, the nights grew longer, the campus feeling eerily still. I welcomed the chill in the air with my oversized sweater. I should finally be comfortable as I settle into bed. Yet on that night, I could feel a sense of unease creeping in. I blamed my night study sessions and my caffeine-filled system for my increased paranoia the past few weeks. As darkness fell, the feeling of being watched returned night after night. But one dreadful night, my unease morphed into tangible fear. While in bed, I glanced outside my window. That's when I saw it. A massive green locust, alive yet eerily frozen. Its large, glistening eyes fixated squarely on me. I pulled back, a shiver coursing down my spine. Was this thing really watching me? It's just an insect, I rationalized. It probably just found a cozy nook. The following nights, much to my growing horror, it returned, perched in the same spot, unmoving at precisely the same hour. I couldn't escape the thought. What was it thinking? Could it even think? For reasons I couldn't explain, it was particularly unsettling. I didn't dare talk about it to anyone, not wanting to risk getting mocked for being afraid of a mere insect. But as my thoughts spiraled, the locust became an inescapable obsession. Each night I found myself counting the minutes until it made its appearance. What did it want? Has it always been there? I found myself getting increasingly more curious, night after night. My curiosity transformed into determination. I needed to know just how long it sits there and watches. The idea of being watched for the entirety of the night was creeping me out. I quickly set an alarm for 2 a.m. Awaked by the alarm 3 hours later, I was bleary-eyed and disoriented in the dark. To my surprise, I was greeted by an absence. The locust was gone. Relief washed over me, yet it left behind a lurking curiosity. Why did it keep returning at the same hour every night? I felt a mixture of dread and intrigue. Finally, I decided to peer out the window. A pit formed in my stomach when my eyes landed on the scene in front of me. A swarm of locusts feasting ravenously on something rotting. The nauseating stench was unbearable, a jumbled mess of bloodied pale fingers, and dangling from their mandibles lifeless eyeballs, staring at me as if making a silent plea for help. I shuddered. The mere number of them sent shivers down my spine. I could practically feel my heart slamming against my chest. Do they know I'm watching? Should I not be watching? Just how sentient are they? My thoughts began spiraling. The instinct to report this horror hit me. I couldn't possibly move on with my life after witnessing such monstrosity. Am I next? Were those eyeballs? No, calm down, you're going crazy. I struggled to regain my composure. Only a couple hours later was I finally able to get back to sleep. As sunlight crept in, I woke up feeling exhausted. I tried to shake off the image of the swarm, but they lingered like shadows. Eventually I reached my class, still feeling foggy from the previous sleepless night. I needed to know what was going on. My first class dragged painfully. Although I was filled with dread, I couldn't help but exit into the yard, where I finally reached that spot. Around me laid scrapes of blackened, reddened leaves, remnants of the horrors that occurred just hours ago. I took a deep breath, thoughts swirling in my mind. I had to tell someone before I start losing it. "You won't believe what I saw last night," I said in a shaky voice as I passed my friend Mark in the hallway. He quickly interrupted. "Sorry, man. Gotta hurry to class. I'm late," he called over his shoulder as he hurried down the hall. Disheartened, I let out a sigh and watched as he left me with my unshared burden. The night got darker, and the air got even chillier than the previous nights. I could almost feel it through my bones. Lying down in bed, I tried to ignore my anxious thoughts, but that didn't come easily. Not when the guardian by my window was missing. Tonight, it decided to go elsewhere. I wondered why. I tossed and turned, trying my best to have deep, steady breaths. Finally, I gave in to exhaustion. Hours later, I woke up abruptly, my chest tight, as if a heavy weight settled upon it. I felt immense guilt. When I opened my eyes, the sight that met me was nothing short of a nightmare. There, hovering just inches from my face, sat the very locust that had plagued my nights. Its enormous black eyes bore into mine. My muscles clenched. I felt my blood running cold in my veins. Paralyzed by sheer terror, I couldn't move a muscle. And then, as if summoned, a swarm exploded, pouring over me. I felt their elongated legs scratch against my skin, their bodies crushing against my chest. They are here for vengeance, I realized as my eyes widened in horror. For I witnessed their grotesque feast. Chaos erupted. The hungry beasts turned my room into a battlefield. Papers flew off my desk. They started tearing at me mercilessly and furiously, while leaving nauseating pain and dread. I'm getting devoured alive. My heart drummed wildly. The weight of terror was suffocating. I need to escape. I must. After what seemed like an eternity at last, I reached for the door with all my might and sprint into the nearest emergency exit, not daring to look behind. I rushed to the nearest bus station, stumbling all the way. The whole trip was a haze. A little over an hour later, I finally got back to the safety of my home. I could finally find solace. The next morning came. I did not get a wink of sleep. Still shaking under my sheets and drenched in sweat. As I laid there, attempting to regain my senses, I realized how close I had come to a horrifying fate. My breath came in shallow gasps, while my heart raced. I couldn't take it anymore. I hopped into the shower, still exhausted, hoping to wash away the terrors. I decided then to grab something to eat. "Hey, I didn't expect to see you here." My brother was startled to see me enter the kitchen early in the morning. "When did you arrive anyway?" "Last night," I mumbled. My face must have shown signs of unspoken horrors. "How come?" "I just needed some things," I said while avoiding eye contact and grabbing whatever leftovers I could find. He didn't press any further and decided to change the subject. "Oh yeah, did I tell you about my new pet I got the other day?" "No, I'll check it out later," I replied as I left to my room. I felt bad. He seemed enthusiastic, but I'm not in the mood to discuss pets right now. I just need to lie in bed and clear my head. I should finally feel at ease, but I can't shake off the feeling of looming danger breathing down my neck. Wherever I look, I see eyes, lurking in the corners, begging me to let my guard down. I can still hear their buzzing in my ears. The terror doesn't end here. Our next tale will make you question what's truly lurking in the night. I recently took a visit to my creepy childhood home. Has anybody ever experienced anything like this? I recently went to visit my parents, who happen to still live in my childhood home. The house sits at the end of our block in a cul-de-sac, and unlike a lot of houses in my old neighborhood, it demands attention with its lopsided appearance, large size, and ancient Victorian architecture. My parents bought it before I was born, refurbished it, and moved in just as my mother was going into labor with me. Ever since I was little, I had always experienced an off feeling about the place. Long shadows filled the halls. Strange noises weren't uncommon at late hours. Night terrors disturbing beyond my years plagued my sleep. I constantly experienced deep feelings of dread both day and night being in the house, and so did my friends apparently. We never hung out at my place, which was just fine by me. Actually, I often looked for excuses to get out of my house anyhow. Most people tend to hold memories of their childhood homes close to their hearts, but I really don't. School kids and adults alike always gossiped about our house, calling it a morbid, creepy eyesore. Some might have even said haunted. A lot of what I think contributed to my childhood fears of the house extended from 2 episodes of some children's shows I used to watch. One being an episode of Curious George, where George imagines hellish faces in his room after visiting a cave. The other was from Caillou, an episode where Caillou's parents checked on him every night, but he was convinced they were monsters watching him from his doorway. These horrible silhouettes with cartoonishly white eyes. All of these episodes I watched in the dark of my living room. All of them made me cry so bad. Another point, I had found a half-decayed squirrel on the property one time, one that I used to feed. It was stuck under a wheelbarrow. Its skin had been peeled away, its eyes popped, and its little mouth grimaced with rotting teeth. That messed me up. I cried for days. The smell I would find after the incident was a lot more common in the house. With my active imagination, experiences, along with the rumors, now it came as no surprise as to why I was always afraid. Now that I'm grown up, you would think it would be easier to forget those fears. They were just kids' shows, a natural cycle of life. But not with this house. We had just finished dinner. Baked chicken, beans, rice, asparagus. As my parents and I walked through the windowless corridors, I remember being drawn toward the distantly familiar yellow wallpaper that made up almost every wall of the damned place. The paper's pattern consisted of a vertical bar wrapped in vines, brown flower etchings that stacked on top of one another, reaching all the way to the ceiling. That continuous bar flower pattern would repeat, trailing into maddening repetition. Truly hideous. We were winding through parts of the house I didn't entirely recognize. Finally, we arrived at an old room. The room, a barely used guest suite, had one window, one dresser, and one bed. An old leather teddy bear was perched on the dresser. Not mine. I didn't know why it was there. I sat my luggage down and slumped onto the bed as my parents walked away. I vividly remember the summer evening sun shining through the window as I unpacked my suitcase. After settling in, I felt nasty after such a long day. It was dark out by this point, so I took my toiletries to the bathroom next to my room. Inconveniently, you had to exit the bedroom and then use an access door from the hall to get to the bathroom. The 2 rooms were adjacent, probably a botched late addition to the house. As a matter of fact, I never recalled seeing that bathroom before that night. Growing up, I had always lived in a bedroom situated towards the front of the house, a door away from my parents' room, actually. The rest of the house was unfamiliar to me. You wouldn't find me exploring it at all. Even my childhood curiosity had understood that exploring the manor was risky somehow. On top of that, my parents were quick to forbid me from wandering if it even appeared that I would, which I wasn't inclined to anyways. Both my parents and I had an emotional understanding, but not a true understanding of why this was. I undressed and got in the shower. The tub was an antique porcelain whatnot with brass feet designed as claws holding glass orbs. A modern shower head and faucet knobs had been installed at some point during a renovation. Something strange happened when I turned on the faucet. The sound of the aging backed-up pipes knocked through the walls. I hadn't even pulled up the shower trigger yet. Red-stained water started spraying in spastic directions from the faucet. I thought at first that because my parents lived on the other side of the house, the plumbing had simply been neglected, causing a buildup of rust or debris. I was more so confused when the pressure eventually released, and a piece of pink muscly meat fell from the faucet into the tub. It looked like a slimy piece of raw chicken, pre-prep. I remember being taken aback, confused, and disgusted. The faucet continued to gurgle, releasing more contaminated water until it started to turn clear and calm. I stood in the tub, cold, staring at the slab of flesh. I figured that some animal must have been caught up in the pipes. I took a thick wad of toilet paper, disposed of the meat in the toilet, flushed the toilet with my foot, washed my hands, then stepped back into the tub, turning on the faucet for a few minutes to let the hot water flush the pipes out. I showered, got dressed, and tucked myself into bed. I sat on my phone for a while, scrolling through Snapchat mindlessly. As time passed, that sense of dread that I had always gotten staying up late at night as a child crept back. I glanced up at that leather teddy bear, beady glass eyes. The few furnishings in the room made shadows, faces. I eventually fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of a peaceful sleep. My phone read 2 a.m. My entire body was in a cold sweat. I covered myself so the only thing uncovered by the heavy pink blankets was my face, like a nun. I relaxed for a while, trying to fall back asleep. Screaming, like a woman going through childbirth, rang from the bathroom next door. The cries were intertwined with a frantic gargling sound. I remember tensing up and lying still. A portion of the fear of the situation disappeared when I realized that my mother might have found herself in the bathroom, slipped, fell, hurt herself. I got out of bed and jogged out of my room to the bathroom. The screaming had stopped before I went in. I opened the door to a single warm light bulb illuminating the room. Read it? What you are about to read is up to your interpretation. The bathtub was full of blood. The entire room stank of what I can best describe as a mixture of raw meat, fried fish, and hand soap. All of that combined with the off-putting dark red paint on the walls made me sick. The entire situation felt like it was designed to be nauseating. This was all added with that strange, empty, late-night panging in my stomach. The blood in the tub was being disturbed the slightest bit by movement underneath. A long cut of pink raw meat, strands of fat attached to it, twitched its way up the side of the tub, making a wet, squinching noise. As it did this, something round bobbed up to the surface, appearing to me as a stripped human head. It had no eyes, and its toothy mouth was gaped open, thick blood running between its teeth and into the tub. I could make out the little details of multifaceted tendrils of muscle from where I was. It was floating sideways, and while I was staring at it, the flesh chunks slapped onto the tile, splattering blood and other fluids onto the floor. It twitched, muscles firing at random, creating small indentations on its slimy surface. I threw up the remnants of my dinner onto the floor. The meat thing was crawling towards me. The head still bobbed sideways in the blood. I came to my senses and started running. I ran through the halls until my head hit something hanging down from the ceiling with a crack, and I blacked out. I woke up the next morning. My parents stood by my bed. I sat up and looked at them. They comforted me and explained what had happened last night, from their view at least. They explained how they had woken up to a loud noise from my side of the house. They cautiously approached, my father with a handgun fearing burglars, but found me unconscious. Asleep, they said. I asked if it looked like I was hurt. They said no, and that they had simply carried me back to bed after I did not wake up despite their trying to get me to. They also explained how they had found, in passing, vomit on the floor of my bathroom, as well as the faucet running for the tub. My mother and father continued by asking me what had happened that night. I told them that I didn't remember anything. My father decided to do a short concussion test on me, then they left. Later that afternoon, I packed my stuff, gave my parents an excuse that I was feeling sick, and left. Every detail about this bothers me. A waking dream, food poisoning, a gas leak would be a hope. A hope. My parents refused to budge. They loved the place, as well as my mind refuses to budge from the idea of an other, because as I was unpacking the other day, I found a squelch of blood on my pajamas from that night. It looked the shape of the tendril. T. Terrence of Warren County, NJ. From one nightmare to the next, we journey into another twisted story that's waiting for you. The coat rack on the balcony outside of mine and Christopher's room would always scare the shit out of me. Child abuse. Every night, whenever I would get up to get myself a glass of water, the coat rack on the balcony outside of mine and Christopher's room would always scare the shit out of me. The rack itself was tall and thin, a large metal sphere perched atop the peak, like an eye surveying its surroundings. But we almost never saw the metal due to the avalanche of coats. In the daytime, there was nothing special about the coat rack, but at night, it was a different story. Christopher was a big fan of horror movies. Black Christmas, When a Stranger Calls, Scream, you name it, and wanted to pass this love down to our children. I was never a fearful man, and would even go as far as to call myself brave. But horror was never my jam. The same could be said for our youngest son, Bob, who had accidentally walked in on us watching the wardrobe scene from The Conjuring and had been leaving his door slightly open every night since. Roy, the oldest, had taken more after Chris in his enjoyment for all things ghastly and ghostly, though at the age of 11, he'd never seen anything more intense than poltergeist. If Christopher ever woke up in the middle of the night, a lifetime of watching horror had numbed him to any potential scare, but I was not so lucky, and thus, the vaguely humanoid shape would scare me shitless whenever I woke up in the middle of the night. Let's get this out of the way now. Waking up at night wasn't a regular occurrence for me. It just so happened that whenever I would, the coat rack was always there, standing on the balcony perpendicular to our bed, overlooking the starry skies of Martha's Vineyard. It's why I tried to drink water and use the restroom before I went to sleep, so I wouldn't have to encounter that cursed hunk of metal, even if I always knew it would be there, just standing still. On one particularly hot night in the middle of July, I had woken up feeling particularly parched. I got out of bed, making sure not to look at balcony as I walked to the door and out of the room, making my way downstairs into the kitchen. Bob's door was, as it always had been, slightly opened, his light snores being barely but surely audible. I poured myself a glass of water, and still sipping it, walked back upstairs, making sure to close the door behind me, but having made a grave mistake when I turned back around, I forgot to avert my gaze and had stared directly at the coat rack. I tripped over my own feet and fell, the glass in my hand getting caught between the floor and my temple and shattering, sending several small shards into my head. I yelled out in pain as Christopher awoke and yelled out at the same time, grabbing several bandages from the bathroom and wrapping them around my head. I could hear the stirring of Bob and Roy downstairs as they had likely heard the thump, and my vision began to blur. A couple hours later, I had awoken in the hospital. The injury fortunately wasn't too serious, but did require a fair bit of stitching, which the nurses thankfully applied while I was unconscious. Chris and the boys had stayed in the room with me the whole time and were overjoyed to see my eyes open. Bob ran up and hugged me, which caused a throbbing pain in my head, alerting me to the stitches in the first place. After some paperwork was done, I was free to go. "Stephen, we really need to do something about that coat rack," Christopher said to me when we got back home, staring at the ungodly object. And so we did. After several years of the coat rack being the source of fear in our household, the two of us took the heavy coats off, threw them on the floor for the time being, and carried the rack downstairs. We placed it next to Bob's bed in his room as a precaution, just so it wouldn't scare anyone else in the living room or any other part of the house where, in fact, Bob had told us that the rack made him feel safe. That night, as I went to sleep, I knew I would no longer have to worry about getting scared if I had to get up for some water. I was wrong. Very, very wrong. In the middle of the night, a small bout of famine hit me. I eased my way out of the bed and nearly jumped out of my skin. The coat rack once again stood on the balcony, and while my eyes were still getting used to the dark, I could just barely make out the faint humanoid shape of it standing there. I guess Bob must have gotten scared and moved it back, I thought. I'll need to talk to him tomorrow about this. I stepped over the coats, littering the floor, and walked downstairs. Just to be safe, I drank out of a paper cup and drank the entire thing in the kitchen. As I was heading up, something caught my attention. The door to Bob's room was ajar, as opposed to his usual slight opening. Intrigued, I peered my head inside the room. Perhaps Bob had just stepped out to use the restroom or get some water. The first thing I noticed when I looked inside was the fact that Bob was no longer in his bed, and the second thing was Bob's dead body lying on the ground. A small, bloody dent was evident in the center of his forehead, his limbs strewn about as if he had been dragged out directly from underneath his covers, from underneath his safety. I'm not afraid to admit that I yelled, screamed even, bringing to the room the attention of both Roy and Christopher. Roy only managed to look at the scene for a brief moment before his eyes rolled up to the back of his head and he fainted. Chris held me as I, in return, held Bob in my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. It was only after the fact that I realized something which had been nagging me for the entirety of the aftermath. Bob lay next to the coat rack which we had placed there, free entirely of coats as Bob owned none. So if the coat rack was in Bob's room the entire time, then what the fuck was on our balcony that night? As the last scream fades, we turn to a new tale of horror, where the real fear has yet to begin. A crying book. I'm a handyman. I'm self-employed and will do any job from building walls to fixing plumbing. I take pride in my work, and thanks to positive word of mouth, I have been able to grow a steady business. I work around the east of England in a county called Suffolk. It's a rural county without a city but a few large historic towns. Today I was working in a small village called Glemsford on the Suffolk border for an eccentric man called Mr. Myers, J.D. Myers. It says above his office door, but I never found out what the J.D. stands for. Mr. Myers is an older man with white, thick hair that has receded to a point where anyone else would have given in to baldness. He is thin with a long face and long bony nose. He always wears a suit, even when he's not working, and has glasses that magnify his eyes so large they become the main feature of his face. As I said, Mr. Myers is an eccentric man, and his house is full of little knickknacks from his many adventures around the world. He's a well-known solicitor for millionaires all over the world. His library, a small spare room in the house, has the most unique pieces. Wooden masks from Africa, jade trinkets from China, and so on. He hired me to build a small wall in the corner of his back garden as a kind of pen for his guinea pigs. Due to the unevenness of the ground, I had been digging it flat for the past 2 days. I had originally quoted him the job as 4 days' work. Today was my 5th day, as the materials had been delayed arriving. Mr. Myers had planned to go to London the day after I was originally planned to finish. He couldn't cancel due to his client only being in the country for a few days. I assured him that I could move some other jobs around and come back to his the day after to finish the wall. He waved it away and said that he trusted me to come in while he was away and continue my work. He left me a key and was gone before I arrived this morning. It's been sunny in the east today, a rarity if you live in England. Hot sun in summer? Never heard of it. It was halfway through the day, and I had just finished with the first layers of bricks for the pen when I heard the Victorian-style doorbell chime. I walked around the side of the house instead of through it, so I didn't dirty the floor. At the door stood a man in a prim black suit and bowler hat with a brown briefcase. He was tall and old with a large, gray, thick mustache. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man turned to me, his face grim and downturned. His voice was deep as he spoke. "You're not Mr. Myers," he said without inflection, yet somehow still surprised. "No, he's away on business today. Can I help you? I need to speak with Mr. Myers." He held up his briefcase. "It's a delivery he's been waiting years for." I was confused. The man felt off in the way he moved and spoke, as if this was of grave importance. "Do you have his number? You could call him, but I doubt he would answer." "You call him." The man interrupted me. Rude, but I'm someone who tries to avoid arguments if possible. I signed and pulled out my phone to ring Mr. Myers. If what this man had was so important, why didn't Mr. Myers tell me he was expecting a package? To my surprise, Mr. Myers answered. "Hello, Nick, is everything all right?" "Hi, Mr. Myers. Yes, everything is fine here. It's just that..." I put the phone to my chest so Mr. Myers couldn't hear what I was saying. Why I did this, I don't know. "What did you say your name is again, mate?" "I didn't," he responded tersely. "Just say it's Clive Kittle. Mr. Kittle has a delivery for you." The other end of the line was silent. "Mr. Myers? Nick, can you show Clive to the library, please, and tell him to put the parcel somewhere he believes is most fit?" "Sure," I said questioningly. It seemed a very odd request. "And Nick, can you leave the library while he does this, please?" "Okay," I said. "Once Clive is gone, can you lock up the house and post the key through the letterbox, please? I would prefer if you finished early today and came back in the morning. I will be there when you arrive." "Okay, will do," I said before hanging up. My mind was racing with questions and intrigue about what was in the briefcase. I live by myself with no partner, and so have a lot of free time on my hands. Because of this, I wouldn't often find myself at home tired after work scrolling through TV and YouTube. I have more than once fallen down the rabbit hole of unsolved mysteries from history. Due to this recurring of my life, I now find myself drawn to mysteries, no matter how small. I am to show you to the library. I said, "and you are to leave the parcel wherever you see fit." Clive Kittle nodded once, sharply, and stood to the side and allowed me to open the door. I showed him to the library. Again, Mr. Myers' house isn't a mansion or state house. It is a semi-modern British village home, and the spare front room was what he called the library. Clive Kittle was in the room for around 20 minutes. I stood waiting patiently. Once he was done and had made sure the door was shut behind him, he left and waited for me just outside the front door. I walked out behind him and flicked the lock before shutting the door. I turned to Clive Kittle. He was standing unnervingly close to me. He was looking down at the key in my hand. Once I realized what he was looking at, I quickly turned and posted it through the letterbox. I even made a show of turning the handle to make sure it was locked. He seemed satisfied without showing it, turned, and walked down the garden path. I waited a few minutes, making sure he was out of sight. I waited a few more minutes, and then a few more. Once I was sure he wasn't going to show up again or drive past the house, I unlocked the front door. It's more uncommon these days, but a lot of homes in Britain used to have locks like this. Ones that you would flick a latch from the inside, but only open from the outside. The key I posted was my own. I needed to know what the parcel was. Unethical? Yes. But curiosity is the only thing that straddles both the deadly sins and the 7 virtues. It will either lead you astray or to greatness. Sometimes it's just 50-50 as to which side you land. Once in, I must admit I started to creep and tiptoe. I have no clue why, probably because it felt like I was doing something wrong, which I was. I even opened the library door slowly. At first I didn't see it, hidden in a corner of the room that hadn't seen sun since the house was built. It was a thick, heavy leather book. I instantly got a headache when I laid eyes upon it. I read the golden embossed words at the top of the front cover. Novem septem oculos, insania, mors. I didn't know what the words meant, and I didn't care, because under neither the words, sculpted in the leather, was a screaming face in anguish that looked as if it were crying. It terrified me. My stomach felt tight, like someone was squeezing it like a stress ball. I lost my sense of time. Hands felt as if they were pressing the sides of my head, like they were trying to crush my skill. I was only there a few seconds, yet it felt like hours of my stomach being squished and my head being pressed. I feel silly saying it now, but I ran from the house, making sure to shut the library door and lock and post the correct key through the front door. I packed my stuff and drove home. I have showered but not eaten. I arrived home at 4. It is now 1 in the morning, and all I've been doing is trying to get that face out of my mind ever since. Ever since I looked at the distorted, horrifying face, I've had trouble blinking. I'm having to think about it. It's not a subconscious thing anymore. Every time I remember to blink, the static that appears behind your eyes when you close them seems more blocky, more three-dimensional. I thought a shower would help to clear my mind. I thought feeling hot water and soft soap would help to clear away how icky I was feeling. When I stepped out of the shower, I cleared the mirror of condensation to see if I looked as bad as I felt when I saw on either side of my head. A slightly purple yet visible handprints on my cheeks and going into my hair. They are tender to touch. I will have to wear a beanie to work tomorrow. The odd thing is, I want to go back. Not to see the book, but to see Mr. Myers and to see if the book has the same effect on him. I need to know if it's a stupid overreaction or genuine. I needed to tell someone, or type it down at least. That's why I thought of this page. It seems like the right place to say what happened. The delivery man was creepy, Clive Kittle. He was creepy, but the book itself was truly horrifying. It intrigues me. I'm going to try and get some sleep. I will keep you all updated on what happens tomorrow. You survived this one, but our next story will test the limits of your sanity. The skin bag, I never should have bought it. That bag, its texture, its warmth, something about it felt so wrong from the moment I touched it, but I was too mesmerized by its strange beauty. I found it in an old antique shop, hidden behind dusty shelves. The shopkeeper barely glanced at me as I picked it up, murmuring something about how it had been there for years, untouched. I should have left it there, in the darkness where it belonged. But I didn't. And now, I'm paying the price. It started small. Little things. At first, I thought I was imagining it. You know those small, creepy feelings you get when you're alone? Like the air shifts or the shadows bend just a little bit differently. Yeah, like that. But it didn't stay small for long. After the first night, I began hearing faint whispers. They were soft, barely noticeable, like someone calling my name from another room. I'd searched the house, but it was always empty. The bag was always where I'd left it, sitting quietly in the corner like a patient predator. On the third night, I had my first nightmare. I dreamt of a girl, her skin peeled away, her face contorted in pain and rage. She stood at the foot of my bed, her eyes hollow, her lips whispering things I couldn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, and there, sitting next to me on the bed, was the bag. I hadn't put it there. It had moved. On its own. I was too scared to touch it, too scared to throw it away. I couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder every night, creeping into my thoughts, turning every dark corner of my mind into a nightmare. My house? It changed too. The windows would fog up without reason. The mirrors would crack when I wasn't looking, and every time I checked my reflection, I swear I saw her, the girl from my dreams. Isha, I later learned her name was. The name came to me in a whisper, like the wind spoke it. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed help. Desperation led me to a shaman, an old woman who lived on the outskirts of town. I didn't believe in such things before, but I couldn't deny what was happening. Something unnatural had latched itself onto me, and that bag was at the center of it all. The moment the shaman laid eyes on the bag, her face twisted in horror. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch it, pulling back at the last second. "You have no idea what you've brought into your home," she whispered, her voice thin with fear. I tried to explain everything, the whispers, the dreams, the moving bag. But she stopped me, shaking her head. "This bag, it's not just cursed, it's evil. It was made from the skin of a girl named Aisha, killed by her best friend out of jealousy. The friend, Samantha, believed she could steal Aisha's beauty by wearing her skin, but the act twisted her soul. What she didn't realize was that Aisha's spirit was bound to it, and her vengeance consumes anyone who possesses it." My throat went dry. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Vengeance?" I stammered. The shaman nodded, her eyes wide and filled with a terror I had never seen before. "Samantha's entire household was slaughtered by the bag. It's cursed, feeding on the lives of those who own it. Aisha's rage will not stop until she's taken back what was stolen." I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy. "What do I do? Can't you help me?" The old woman's face darkened. "There's no undoing what's been done. You must destroy it." "How?" She shook her head, already looking defeated. "You can't. People have tried. Fire, water, even burying it deep in the earth, it always comes back. The only thing you can do is run as far as you can. But even then, I'm not sure you can outrun her." I left her home in a panic, clutching the bag in my hands, unsure of what to do. The streets seemed darker as I walked, every shadow seeming to stretch towards me. I could feel it. Isha was close. She was watching. That night, I tried to leave the bag outside, thinking maybe I could abandon it. But the moment I stepped back into the house, it was there, sitting in the middle of the room, waiting. The whispers were louder than ever, now calling my name over and over again. I don't know what to do. Every time I close my eyes, I see her, Aisha. Her skinless body, her hollow eyes filled with hate. The bag seems to move closer on its own, inching toward me, always a little closer when I'm not looking. I can feel it tightening around my mind, like a noose I can't escape. The shaman was right. There's no escaping this. The bag will take me, just like it took Samantha and everyone else. I just hope someone reads this before it's too late. If you ever find an old leather bag in a forgotten shop, no matter how beautiful it seems, don't touch it, don't buy it, don't take it home. It will find you, and when it does, there will be no escaping its curse. Don't get too comfortable. The real terror lies just ahead in the next story. I keep receiving 911 calls for emergencies that haven't happened yet. I know that another call is coming today. I don't know when, and I know why, but it will. They have been the only constant in the chaotic maelstrom of decision and consequence that has been the last few weeks of my life. Oddly reassuring knowing I can look forward to them, yet completely powerless to know exactly when they will occur, or more importantly, what I should do about them. Any doubt is gone. I have seen too many things to believe it is just some trick or coincidence. I don't want to believe, but I have to now. I know I have a responsibility to do something. I just don't know what that is most of the time. I am tired and overwhelmed, but someone has to do something, and that someone is me. I was chosen to know what will happen, and given the burden of stopping it, or just bearing witness. I suppose I understand how ignorance can be bliss now. Sorry. I should elaborate and tell you what has been happening to me these last few weeks. I know it might sound crazy, but bear with me. The first call was 2 weeks ago. I was just getting off work and had to take care of something that was equal parts annoying and expensive. I needed to pick up a new phone since I managed to completely break my old Galaxy by dropping it the day before. The screen shattered, of course, but worse, some damage to the internal components completely broke it, and it would not boot up or do anything other than display a blank screen. As I was about to head out to purchase my new device, the seemingly dead phone sprang to life and started ringing. Not with my own ringtone, but a strange chime I had not heard before, and was not sure if it was even in the list of pre-programmed ringtones. I was confused how it could still ring, but was momentarily relieved since I figured it might still work after all. I could not really afford anything better at the moment anyway, so if I could, I would save the expense. Putting aside the decision to keep my shattered phone a while longer or not, I answered the call. I was surprised and disturbed when before I could even say hello, an panic-stricken voice cut me off. Help! Oh God, please help, someone stabbed him. They stabbed Michael, please send help. It sounded like someone was trying to call the emergency line, and somehow it got sent to my broken phone. I was confused, and I tried to explain to the distraught person on the phone that I was not emergency services. I am sorry. I know it sounds like a real emergency there, but you need to dial 911 and get help. I don't know who this is, and I can't track the location. This is a personal cell phone, not 911. Before I could try and explain more, I was cut off. What do you mean? I did call 911. I need help. Someone stole our car and stabbed my boyfriend, Michael. We need help now. Get a real dispatcher or something, please. He is losing so much blood. We need help now. We are near the park on, what was it? She paused, likely confirming the address. We are on 4th Ave and Beckett Street. I think please send help. I did not know what I could do. I had tried to suggest they call 911, but they sounded sure that they had. I did not know how to tell the panicked woman that I couldn't help. I finally decided on a plan and told her, "All right, ma'am, try and stay calm. I will try and call emergency services myself and send them there. Please try and call 911 again over there and see if it routes you correctly so someone can help. What can I tell them your name is?" There was a pause, and the voice on the other line spoke again. "It's Kendra. Kendra." "Whoa." Static interrupted her response, and after a moment, the line went dead. I tried to call 911, but after that call, my dead phone had died once again, and it was unable to make even an emergency call. I hoped that whoever that Kendra woman was got hold of emergency services. I had no idea how I had gotten the call, but either way, they really needed help, and I sure was not an EMT. I thought they likely got through since I did not get another call, but the more I thought about it, the more concerned and responsible I felt. I considered the location she gave. I knew that park. It was not too far from where I was, so I figured I would go and check and make sure that they got through to 911, and someone was there on scene to help. I drove out to the park and found the corner of the park by 4th and Beckett. Not many people were around since it was fairly late in the evening. Certainly, no signs of a stabbing or carjacking on this street corner. Since no one was around, I started thinking that maybe I had been the victim of a prank and that no one was here. It might have just been some elaborate crank call meant to rile people up about emergencies for some kind of sick entertainment. I felt upset by being fooled, but also relieved that no one was really in trouble, and I decided to head home. The Verizon store was closed by that point, so I would have to try again tomorrow. I stuffed the Verizon coupon I had saved and hoped would help discount a new phone for me back into my pocket. Having scribbled the address that Kendra had given me on the back of the paper, I started to feel silly for having gone out there. The next evening after work, I was planning to go buy the overpriced replacement for my phone again. As I got into my car to leave, I fumbled in my pocket for the coupon I had received and had written the address from the prank call the day before on. It was not there. My heart sank. It was a coupon for $100 off on a new Galaxy phone, which, considering how much they cost, was not a huge percentage, and I would have to finance it anyway. Still, $100 was $100. I still had a while before the store closed, so I decided to check back by the park. I thought maybe I may have dropped it there when I had gotten out to look for the so-called crime scene. It was a stupid idea, I knew that. I figured that unless someone was going to buy a phone, they might not have picked it up and it could still be there. I drove back to where I had been the previous night. There were more people around this time. A few joggers, some bike riders, and people walking the trail. I parked and got out of my car and started looking near where I had been standing the night before. The whole idea was stupid, but if it could save me a bit of money, I would go for it. As expected, after fumbling around for a few minutes, I could not find the paper anywhere, and I started walking back to my car. I saw a young couple walking hand in hand back to the parking lot as well. They had arrived back at their car, and the gentleman opened the door for his lady. I thought the gesture was very sweet, which made the next few moments even more horrifying. As he closed the door and started to the driver's side, a figure dressed in all black jumped out of the nearby bushes and shouted at the man. I couldn't make out the words from where I was, but he was holding something. And when the gentleman reached into his pocket, the figure in black lunged forward and attacked. He seemed to stab the gentleman several times, and I heard a scream from the woman who had just emerged from their car. She was still screaming and rushed towards the fallen man, and I thought I heard her shout, "Michael, no!" I stood there frozen, unable to act. I knew I should help, but I was paralyzed by the sudden brutality and horror of the situation. Before I could move, the man in black peeled out of the parking lot in the couple's car. They remained where they were. Her screaming continued, and she held on to him. The sound had finally snapped me out of my confused and terrified daze, and I raced over to try and help. As soon as I approached, the woman looked up at me. Her hands were covered in the man's blood, and she begged for help. "Help, call 911. He's been stabbed, my Michael. He's been stabbed." I fell back in confused shock. The voice was familiar. The name was too. That was the woman from the phone call yesterday. It sounded exactly like her. There was no mistaking it. I couldn't understand how it was all happening in that moment. My confused reverie was interrupted by the woman shouting me back to my senses. "Don't just stand there. Please, we need help." I did not know how to respond, but I managed to stutter out a meek, My phone's broken. I am so sorry. Maybe I can find help." As I backed away trying to figure out what to do, a jogger had happened by and raced over to help. She sat down with them and was assisting in stabilizing Michael. She had given her cell phone to the woman who seemed to be calling 911. As she finished dialing the number, I felt an odd tingling in the air, and suddenly my broken phone vibrated, and a notification bell chimed. I sat there dumbly watching everything unfold in disbelief. After a brief delay, I heard her speak, and I was not prepared, though perhaps I should have been, for what happened next. "Help. Oh God, please help, someone stabbed him. They stabbed Michael. Please send help." I felt an odd thrumming of electrical energy from the phone as she spoke, and I knew what she was going to say next. "What do you mean? I did call 911. I need help. Someone stole our car and stabbed my boyfriend, Michael. We need help now. Get a real dispatcher or something, please. He is losing so much blood. We need help now. We are near the park on..." What was it? I unconsciously mouthed the words that followed, since I had heard them less than 24 hours before. "We are on 4th Ave and Beckett Street. I think please send help." Another brief pause, and then she would say her name. The buzzing and thrumming from the phone stopped moments after she said her name. "It's Kendra. Kendra Wallace. Hello? Hello? Is anyone there? Please send someone. He is going to bleed to death, please." She continued screaming into the phone and then went back to Michael prone form while the jogger who had come to help attempted to call emergency services again. It sounded like she had gotten through, as was giving the location to someone on the phone. When an ambulance arrived, I left the scene. I couldn't handle the insanity of what I had just experienced. How in the hell did I get a phone call about all of the things that had happened that night, the day before? I fell into my car and gripped the wheel and tried to process the insanity of what had just happened. I had no idea how any of this was possible. As I tried to keep from hyperventilating, I heard another notification on my phone. I had received a text message somehow. Despite the messenger app not functioning, it had a message screen displayed with one unread message. I tried to see if any other apps or anything would work, and it would not navigate to anything else. The only thing I could do was to open the thread. It left me even more confused than I had been before the message just read. Come on, were you even trying? Better luck next time. See you around, M. I had so many questions. Chief among them was who the hell was M? And how did they know about what had happened? Before I had time to consider the madness of the situation, my phone started to ring again in the same weird chime from yesterday. I had a feeling I knew what would happen if I picked up. Holding my breath and steeling myself, I answered the call. I keep receiving 911 calls for emergencies that haven't happened yet. Part 2. Placing the phone to my ear and not knowing for certain what to expect, I managed a meek hello. A voice on the other end responded. They sounded very young, likely a child. Hello, is this 911? We need help. We got in a big car accident and Mommy and Daddy are not moving. I think they are really hurt. Please help. My heart sank. I started to panic. I did not know if this was really happening or was going to happen like the other call. Whatever the case, this kid's parents were seriously injured or worse. I couldn't exactly call 911 myself and tell them that something bad somewhere was going to happen. I resolved to get as much information from the terrified child on the phone as possible. Maybe then I could do something about it, whatever that might be. I heard crying on the line, and I spoke slowly and clearly to try and reassure the poor thing that help would arrive, just not in the way she likely expected. I know this is scary, but I promise I am going to try and help. What is your name and your parents' names? The crying abated slightly, and the trembling reply was, Chloe. My name is Chloe. My parents are Richard and Abigail. That is great, Chloe. Thank you. And what is your last name? It's Keller. I was grateful she was old enough to know their family surname. Thank you, Chloe. Can you tell me what happened? How did your mommy and daddy get hurt? What happened with the car accident? Did your car hit something? Or did someone hit your family's car? We were just driving down the road, and we were waiting at a red light, and as soon as it turned green, and we started going again, a silver car hit us on the side and knocked our car over, and it sped off. I heard more crying, and I tried to speed up the questioning without pressuring her. I didn't know how long I had. Do you know what type of car your family has? What color of car is it, and what is the brand name on the back? There was brief hesitation, and then she spoke again. It is a red car. I think the label says it is a toy something, Toyota. I don't know anything else, that is just what the label says. Red Toyota was something to go on at least, though I had wished I had the model as well. I did not bother asking for the plate number. I doubted she would know or be able to check that. Thank you, Chloe. You are being so brave. Now can you see where you are? Are you able to see any road signs to help find where you and your family are? I hoped she was able to see something to help find them. I had a terrible feeling that if this was somewhere rural, I might not be able to find wherever it was happening. I think I see a sign. I can't get out of the car. I am stuck. It is getting hard to see. There's smoke everywhere. I think I can see a sign by the light we were passing. It says Bishop or Bishop or something. I can't tell from here. Please, it is getting hard to breathe in here. I was dreading the implication of what she said last. If there was a fire and she was stuck in that vehicle and no one was around to help, she would not have much time. Okay, that is great. Can you see another sign or anything else that can help locate you and your mommy and daddy? She started to speak again, but went into a coughing fit that lasted for several seconds. She managed to start again. I don't see another street sign, but there is a bus stop or something near the road. I think I see a number 18 on it. I think, oh no, help. The car is on fire now. Help. Please. Help. Static assaulted my eardrums as I lowered the phone in an anxiety-fueled stupor. The phone was dead again, of course. No indication it had just answered a call from a terrified little girl in the future. I had to do something. I had no idea if it was really going to happen twice. I would not take any chances, though. I hoped that the call came from within the city limits. Otherwise, it could be anywhere. And the chance of finding the right street and getting there on time tomorrow was near impossible. I looked up the municipal bus routes and tried to find a bus stop or route marked 18. With a little map work, I was able to locate it, and sure enough, it was right near the streetlight and intersection of Bishop Street and Mullen Ave. I had my location, or so I thought. Now I just needed to know when it was going to happen. I realized I forgot to ask what time it was when I was asking for details. I checked the phone, just in case it had a timestamp from the call, but it would not display anything. My hunch was that since the call yesterday came later in the evening and the actual event occurred at a similar time of night, that the emergencies that correspond to the calls occurred at the same time, just on the subsequent day. I did not want to risk it in case I was wrong, so I resolved to take the next day off of work and get to that intersection and go on a stakeout and wait. I got there at around 6 in the morning and parked on the curb near the bus stop, but not blocking it. It was going to be a long day, but I tried to remain alert and vigilant. As I had expected, nothing happened in the morning or afternoon. I was about to conclude my theory as correct and expect the accident to occur near 10 o'clock in the evening based on the time of the previous call. It was 4:42 in the afternoon, and I was about to step out of the car to find a nearby public restroom, since I had been sitting there for so long. Suddenly, the phone sprang to life with that eerie chime. I looked at the road frantically for a red Toyota. The phone kept ringing, and I realized it might not be related to this instance. It might be a different emergency call. I answered, and I heard a new desperate voice begging for help. Hello, 911? My name is Stacy Thomas. I am at the rest stop on exit 112, and we need ambulance and police here right now. A woman has been assaulted, and she is in bad shape. I think she is still alive, but I don't know. Please send someone. It was another one. I had to get more information. All right, Miss Thomas, did you see anything happen, or did you just find this woman? I was driving on the interstate and stopped to use the restroom. When I got to the woman's room, there was an out-of-order sign in front, but I heard a cry for help and found a woman who was battered and barely conscious inside. I don't know what happened, but we need help here now. I considered how I could ask for more details without sounding strange and upsetting the woman on the phone. All right, I promise help will arrive. Would you please tell me if the woman has an ID on her to identify? Also, if she has any keys on her, would you be able to tell what car she has parked there, if it is still there? There was an audible hesitation, and I figured she was considering the odd question. Isn't that something the police can do when they get here? We need help now, she is barely holding on. This is a medical emergency as well. Can't the police investigate? It was a fair question, and I could tell she was getting impatient, so I was considering how to rephrase it to emphasize the importance of the detail. When to my shock and horror, I heard the audible static that signaled the end of the divining phone call. Hello? Hell? Oh, are still there. 5 more seconds of loud static, and the phone was dead. I wrote down all of the details I had for that call. They would have to do. I figured at least I had a location and a general time, though the call was after it happened, so I would have to get there early enough to try and stop it. I wrote down my game plan for tomorrow in my notebook. After my deliberation, I noticed it was starting to get dark outside, and I had to focus on the accident that was going to happen that day. One emergency at a time, I figured. It was getting closer to 10, and I was on high alert. I still did not know what I was going to do to stop the accident. When it was just a few minutes before 10, I got out of my car and walked up to the light. I was just going to have to get their attention when I saw them and hopefully stop them from crossing at the fateful moment. Sure enough, just a few minutes after 10, a red Toyota Corolla was heading towards the light and came to a stop. I looked in and saw a man driving the car with a woman in the passenger seat and a child in the back seat. I tried to flag them down, but they may have thought I was a panhandler, and the father ignored my attempts at getting their attention. My heart was racing. The light was about to change to green, and I knew in my gut it was going to happen. I decided to do something crazy, and I leaped into the road, directly blocking the car from going any further. The father scowled and started honking the horn at me, and the mother had a concerned, almost pitying look on her face. I realized I probably looked crazy to them, but I had to try and stop them from going at just that moment. I looked behind me, and the light turned green. Nothing happened, and when I did not see a speeding car immediately, I started to doubt myself. The father looked angry now and was unbuckling his seatbelt, probably to get out and throw me off of the road. He never got the chance. I felt the air pressure and wind blast from a speeding car behind me, and a load crash and strangled scream rang out. I looked behind, and a silver sedan was speeding away from the intersection, trailing blood in its wake. I did not know what it was, but something seemed familiar about that car. I realized in sudden horror that I had seen it before. It was the young couple's car from the night before. It had been stolen, and the carjacker was still in possession of it. Before I could make sense of the horrible connection, I realized that despite saving the family in the car, someone else had not been so lucky. A cyclist had been crossing the road at the same time and was apparently struck by the speeding car instead of the family. I was stunned by the damage that had been done. The man on the bike was torn up and was very likely dead already. I could not process what I was seeing, but I heard a voice shouting in the dim periphery of my senses. "Richard, call 911, we need help. Someone hit that man." Chloe's parents stepped out of the car and told her to stay inside. She regarded me as I back away, and I saw the couple near the body of the biker calling the real emergency services. I backed up with a confused mix of emotions. I had saved the young family, but it had led to that cyclist being stuck instead. As I stood there in a daze, my phone vibrated, and I noticed I had another message. I studied my trembling hands and read it. "Very utilitarian of you. You saved 3 by sacrificing 1. You are doing better, but not quite there. Keep it up and don't disappoint me." I had no idea how to feel. I thought I could save them, and I did, but at the cost of someone else. I could not figure out why this was happening to me. Why was I chosen? I felt confused and numb, but I had to put those feelings aside. Another crisis had to be resolved, as I had to prepare to handle the other call from tomorrow today. As the echoes of the last tale fade, something far more sinister is coming. Black bear child abuse. When I was a child, I had a phobia of bears. I'd say it was a pretty rational fear, actually. After all, they are massive killing machines that could easily outrun you and crush your skull in their jaws. At 10 years old, I had seen a movie about a killer bear hunting a group of people lost in the woods and picking them off one by one. My parents hadn't intended for me to see it. I just happened to witness it on my friend's television when I was over at his house one evening. However, this fear was kept a secret by me, even when my family packed up and went on a week-long camping trip to the mountains. My twin sister and I were informed of how to stay safe as we stayed in that maze of a forest. We were to never stray too far and never keep food in our tent, or it would attract bears. We had a can of bear mace with us, and my father was armed with a rifle he was licensed to carry. He wasn't a hunter, he was just a very cautious man whose favorite phrase was "better safe than sorry." He explained to us that many dangers, animal and otherwise, could be lurking in the woods. After all, we were secluded. No nearby park rangers and friendly campers for miles. He never liked the thought of us being vulnerable, and I wasn't about to complain. Despite the security of all our precautions, I still had nightmares of waking up to a bear sniffing around outside my tent. I slept in a small tent alone, and so did my sister Esther. We were pretty trustworthy and independent kids, so they trusted us with our own tents while they slept in a bigger one together. We grew up sheltered from the harsh realities of life and the shocking horror movies that instilled nightmares into other children's heads. Because of this, growing up, we weren't as anxious of the dark or things that go bump in the night as other kids. I hadn't needed a nightlight since I was 3, but boy, how things had changed since then. My friend, George, had laid-back parents who let him practically do whatever he wanted, and that meant watching whatever he wanted. He had pressured me into sharing his hobby of watching horror movies, which ranged from laughable failures to terrifying masterpieces. This left an impression on me. It felt like those movies had warped my mind. Every creak in my house at night was now a possible intruder, and every shadow could have a masked serial killer using it as a cover to catch me off guard. Despite this, I enjoyed those movies with him, and like a horrible addiction, I couldn't shake. I just kept coming back. But enough of that. I would like to tell you a story that still confuses and terrifies me to this day. It started with that one family camping trip. For most of the week, it was your average vacation. We would swim in the lake nearby on a humid afternoon. We would eat sausages roasted over the fire for dinner and make s'mores for dessert. Dad told us a few cliché campfire stories, and then Mom would crawl into our tents and kiss us goodnight before she retired into her own. I absolutely dreaded bedtime during camping. I dreaded when the fire would be put out, dousing us all in darkness. I dreaded when I would be the last one to fall asleep, and a lonely feeling would creep up on me. I dreaded when I had to take a leak in the middle of the night and would crawl out of my tent with a flashlight, aiming it in all directions in a rather paranoid manner. When dawn would finally crest the mountain peaks and birds began their heavenly chorus in the treetops, a wave of relief would hit me instantly. One night felt the longest. That day had begun typically with a trip to the lake in our swimwear. There was a trail circling the lake, and we would hike it. Our parents were laying in the sand, drinking beer from the cooler, chatting with each other idly as my sister and I decided to take the short walk on the trail. The area wasn't so densely wooded, and the lake was mid-sized, so they could easily spot us. Esther and I were talking as we sipped from our water bottles, joking about Dad's short shorts. We stumbled across the paw prints of a bear embedded in the dirt, pointing in the direction we were walking. Esther kneeled down in front of the prints, smiling. Bear paws. Mom said black bears are seen around here a lot. I think black bears are the cutest bears. She noticed my unease. What's wrong? Are you scared of bears, Eli? Who isn't scared of bears? I self-consciously replied, a bit more snappishly than I intended. Let's go. They look new. It's probably still around. Esther ignored me. I was about to yell at her when I realized she had a perplexed look on her tanned face. She pointed at the paw prints. Those are the back paws of a bear. You can tell because of how long they are. She stated, I read a book about all sorts of bears, and you can tell the difference between the front and back paws. Her knowledge wasn't surprising to me. Esther was a huge fan of animals, even the dangerous, predatory ones. She wanted to be a zoologist when she grew up, and she made it known constantly. However, I wasn't interested in hearing any fun facts from her at that moment. I mean, I never was, but especially not right then. So what? Let's go. I grew more and more antsy with each second that passed. I kept looking around us at the surrounding trees, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of a hulking beast with razor claws. Esther didn't let up. She still looked confused, as if she were struggling over a very complex puzzle. Her eyes, which were a murky brown like the lake's waters, followed the trail of footprints which cut off at a bush. She stood up and brushed dirt off her knees. Eli, she started, her eyebrows furrowed. There's only back paw prints. It's like he was standing up and walking on his 2 feet. The serious expression dissolved as she burst into laughter. I just imagined it. It looked so funny, so cute. I gawked at her. A bear? Cute? I simply rolled my eyes as we returned to the lake's shore, ignoring what she'd said. We promptly told our parents of our findings, but they weren't particularly concerned. We stayed there for another hour. I was swimming backwards, enjoying myself, when something caught the corner of my eye, a flash of movement on the other side of the lake. I stood upright from my backstroke position, curious. At this point, I was relaxed, no longer worried about a bear, and I figured it could have been a wandering stag we could admire from afar. I slightly squinted my eyes, having lost sight of it among the tree's many overlapping shadows. That's when I saw a big, furry arm move further behind a thick tree trunk. My heart sank. It was definitely a bear. No other animal had such an identical appendage. The way its arm hung down made it obvious it was in a standing position. Now I couldn't see it because it had hid itself completely. Was it scared of us? That's normal, I heard. Often the big scary animals we feared were scared of us as well, but that did little to quell my anxiety. I started to swim back to where my sister and parents were playing in the shallow end. I did not say anything yet. I just kept an eye on that side of the woods. I was almost there when a large, furry head peeked out from behind the tree. Just as quick as it had done that, it drew back. It wasn't too quick for me to notice some pretty startling details, however. Despite the distance, I could see white in its eyes because they were so big and gaping. Wait, bears didn't have very noticeable whites in their eyes, did they? There was something else pretty off about its face, but I didn't look long enough to figure it out. I explained to my family what I'd seen, and they finally agreed to leave. We got our stuff ready pretty quickly and left the lake. I can't tell you how many times I looked over my shoulder as we walked back, my hands shaky. "Calm down, bud," my father said soothingly. "It was probably just curious. Besides, we have the mace in case it decides to bother us." I said nothing in response. Esther held my hand reassuringly, and I didn't give any reaction to that either. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept up on me. I kept replaying the memory of its head poking out and staring at me with wide, oddly human-like eyes. Thinking back on it, I started to feel like something was also wrong with its snout, but still didn't know what specifically it was. The rest of that evening before bed transpired uneventfully. I was silent for the most part, convincing myself in my head that I had imagined the creepy aspects of the bear's face. Too many horror movies will do that to you, I reasoned with myself. That's the explanation my parents would give me. They were definitely not the superstitious or spiritual type, so they could provide a rational explanation for anything. We started preparing for bed, hanging our food up far away so the scent wouldn't attract any animals, and dousing the fire again. I made sure to take care of my business before crawling into my tent to prevent my usual 3 a.m. nature calls. I settled into my covers, trying to fall asleep before everyone else. My family, as always, stayed awake in their tents for about an hour, with their lanterns shining from inside. Usually they were up reading. They were all bookworms, unlike me. Despite my best efforts to fall asleep, their lamps turned off one by one before mine. Wide awake, I stared at the roof of my baby blue tent for a long time, observing the shadows of bugs crawling along the fabric. A candlefly had gotten in and flitted around my little electric lamp, but I refused to switch it off. It was way too bright and hurt my eyes, but I didn't care. I listened closely to the nighttime cacophony of insects, straining to hear any abnormalities. One moment, I was awake, and the next, I was watching the darkness behind my eyelids. A dream interrupted the peaceful emptiness of my mind. I preferred it hadn't. It was disturbing and confusing, vivid and surreal. I was in the forest alone, no campsite, no gear, and no companions. Helpless. Vulnerable. I stood like a statue among the maze of trees until I saw that dreadful bear peek from around a tree. In the dream, it was a lot closer, only a few feet away. I could see the details of its strange face. Its face was skinny and elongated, almost like a dog instead, and its mouth was crooked, as if deformed, and drooled all over its matted black fur. The deformity of its snout was bizarre. It was uneven and bent awkwardly to the left. Its eyes were very human, just like I suspected. Wide, with brown irises and large pupils. The head itself seemed too big in comparison to its snout. It was as if a small child had drew a bear from memory, without any reference especially, and it suddenly came to life. An icy chill of fear rippled down my spine. I felt cold and mortified by this discovery. I felt as if I couldn't move an inch, or it would lunge for me. The bear leaned further out from behind the tree, grasping the trunk with its spindly fingers. Its fingers reminded me of a raccoon's, too human for comfort, but still tipped with long, jagged claws. It tapped its claws rhythmically against the bark. Its mouth hung open, as if its jaw were dislocated. Saliva dripped onto the forest floor, and all was completely silent. Its eyes. God, its eyes. Why were they so soulless? They stared so unblinkingly. No emotion, never leaving my gaze. What could it be thinking? I prayed that it wouldn't get worse. I tried to open my mouth to speak, to beg for mercy, but I couldn't pry my lips apart. The bear spoke instead, startling me so deeply that I wanted to cry out in terror. Its voice was deep, cold, and sounded like a very hateful, malicious, and old entity. Something that had been rotting and festering with rage. I won't starve. My guess is as good as yours. Did it intend to eat me? I woke up pretty quickly afterward. I was disappointed to find that it was still quite dark outside, with no hint of a sunrise in sight. Still, I had to pee. Again. I sat there in the dark and held it for the longest time, listening to the crickets chirp and my shaky breaths. I realized that the lamp was off and pressed the switch to turn it on. A pit grew in my stomach as I realized it wouldn't turn on. The batteries had drained. I hastily fumbled for my flashlight, craving a source of illumination as the darkness smothered me. I couldn't even hear the sound of my dad snoring, which strangely made me feel safe. The flashlight would not work either, although I had changed its batteries recently. Confused and angry, I muttered curses too foul for my 10-year-old mouth. Stupid fucking thing. That's when I heard footsteps outside. I stiffened and listened closely. Grass and twigs crunched under someone's feet as they tread through the campsite. One of my family members, for certain. Most likely Esther. I felt relief flow through me. Knowing someone was awake decreased that dreadful, lonely feeling, a feeling that I was alone in my terror. Some comforting words from my sister would be much appreciated. I peeled the cover from my lap as warm orange firelight began to glow. I started to reconsider the late-night walker being my dad instead. When the sun was close to rising, he would light a fire and relax before everyone woke up. I knew this because I was up early one day and could experience the beautiful sight of dawn with him. This excited me more than the prospect of it being my sister. On all fours, I leaned towards my tent flaps and unzipped them. The zipper got stuck halfway. I struggled with it for a second until my eyes glanced at the campfire my tent was facing. I stopped messing with the zipper and stared. Oh God, that wasn't my dad or my sister. It wasn't anyone I knew, nor was it human. A lump grew in my throat as I watched the furry figure of a bear sit on a log by the fire, facing my direction. The fire was small and just barely lit, its crooked, unhinged snout and large, unseeing eyes. I couldn't even tell if it was looking directly at me, but I didn't want to look anymore. I started crying quietly as I zipped my tent back up, literally pissing myself. Choked with a primal fear, I hid under my cover. An unnatural, heavy feeling settled over my chest. It felt like something was sitting on me, pushing against my ribcage, weighing me down. My head started to spin. I felt so dizzy, and I tried to move. It felt like an extra 500 pounds had been added to each of my limbs. I could barely lift my hand 3 inches off the ground. My eyelids fluttered, half closed. At the time, my child brain figured this is what it felt like to be drunk, having seen my father return from the bar and collapse in the living room, unable to stand on his own. I managed to move my arm enough to rustle the cover off of my eyes, so I could at least see in my tent. I realized that the night had gone eerily silent. There were no more crickets or cicadas singing, no more owls hooting, nothing. Only the sound of the fire crackling and the deep growling and grunting of an aggressive bear. This bear sounded very real and normal, not an anthropomorphic bear with a baritone voice. Footsteps neared my tent and circled it. I wanted to scream and to cry, hopefully waking up my parents who would save me from this nightmare. However, nothing but a pitiful fusion of a squeak and a whimper escaped my trembling lips. It felt like my throat was being constricted. I couldn't move a muscle or utter one syllable. All I could do was move my eyes. A large snout poked and prodded at the tent, sniffing. The bear outside roared, piercing the silence. I had always thought a bear's roar sounded miserable and desperate, unlike the mighty roar of a lion. It did. Not only that, but it sounded angry and ravenous. My eyes followed the faint silhouette of the bear walking on all fours at the rear of my tent. I hoped to God it would just go away. I figured he might have heard me, because the bear's head looked at me for a second. right before it walked off into the darkness. The heavy feeling pinning my body down was starting to lighten up. I opened my mouth to scream. A voice interrupted me. A snarling voice sounding as old as time and as nasty as sin itself. "I will not starve." My head snapped towards my tent flaps. The terrifying mockery of a bear had its deformed head sticking into my tent. Its gaping, twisted maw and round, glassy eyes were closer than ever before. Even worse, his long fingers, tipped with even longer claws, reached towards me. I released a scream so deafening that I'm sure any woodland critter within a 5-mile radius would have been frightened away had they heard it. The bear gripped me by the hair and dragged me out of the tent, so fast I barely processed it. I flailed around in the dirt and grass, screaming for my family to help me. "Mom! Dad! Esther!" I wailed in terror, helplessly reaching for their tents. The bear growled lowly as it continued to drag me through the campsite, absolutely no one coming to my aid. Surely they couldn't have still been asleep? "Don't starve me?" The bear wheezed, its voice warbling and growing higher in pitch, as if it were whining. Globs of its spit landed on my pale, tear-streaked face. It let go of me not too far away from the tents, dropping me at its normal-looking back paws. I tried scrambling away, but it immediately pounced down and began to devour me. Gripping my frail arm in between its long fingers, it bit down as hard as it could with an unhinged lower jaw. The monster ripped my entire arm off. Flesh and bone gave way to its teeth. The pain nearly blinded me. My mind had gone full prey at that moment. All I could do was scream and desperately try to crawl away with my one arm. I didn't dare fight back, not at first. The bear's paw balled up my shirt in the back and flipped me over, so I was stomach up and looking at his weird face. My eyes bulged as I gaped at him, vision blurry from a fountain full of tears. The black bear panted heavily, from excitement or effort I did not know, but with each pant expelled in a puff of hot air, its lower jaw flapped loosely. Without thinking, I grabbed its lower jaw and began to pull with all my strength, fueled by adrenaline and a sudden surge of courage. I figured that was his weak spot, and I was correct. In fact, it was too easy to pull half of his jaw off his face. The meat gave way with a fleshy squelching and cracking sound, as if it were already weak and decayed. The bear howled in pain much like a man would, and frantically pawed at its face. I stood up and ran to my parents' tent. I felt disoriented and fell against the front of it before I attempted to unzip it. To my relief, they were already opening it from inside. I could also hear Esther clambering out of her hot pink tent behind me. All three of their faces were white, as if bloodless. They looked almost as spooked as I did. My mom screamed bloody murder as she saw the bloody stump that was my shoulder. I fell into her arms, feeling weak and sleepy. Esther's screams collided with Mom's and made a very chilling chorus of horror. My dad was sprinting in action, tossing my mom a first aid kit and going to the car to start it. As my sister and mother peered over me, I weakly turned my head to see the bear. It was gone. Nowhere to be found, not even its broken-off jaw. "Baby, oh God, my poor baby, what happened?" My mom cried, smoothing my hair away from my face. "Bear," I sobbed, my voice cracking as waves of pain rolled through my body, wrecking my nerves. I couldn't even say anything else. I just cried as the agony continued its assault on my little body. In the car, we drove miles and miles to where we could get help, as my mom tended to me to the best of her abilities with the first aid kit. I was in and out of consciousness, listening to their conversation. There was no mention of the bear's strange appearance. In fact, it sounded like they hadn't even seen the bear. Later, my sister would tell me that she heard the bear attacking me, but it felt as if there was a weight pinning her body down to the ground. She couldn't get out the tent and found it so strange that she wondered if she was having sleep paralysis and imagining the attack. I think the same thing happened to Mom and Dad, although they didn't speak about it in front of me. My family thought that a normal bear had come into my tent and dragged me out, but was scared away by the sounds of them getting out of the tent. I tried to tell them what I had seen and heard, but they didn't believe me, of course. They thought I was simply experiencing the effects of trauma and painting it to be much scarier than it already was. I still don't know what that thing was. A bear which spoke without moving its mouth, walked like a man everywhere it went, and caused such a strange effect on people and things, like silencing the environment and rendering my family helpless to stop it. I also wondered about the very real bear that distracted me from the creature sneaking up on me. Was that real or an illusion? They could not find the bear that supposedly attacked me in order to kill it. It took me a while to adapt to life with one arm missing. The ripped-off arm had disappeared with repair, and a severe case of PTSD. Now, I am in college, and I have never stepped foot in another forest again. My dormmates want to go on a camping trip during spring break, and I let them know that if they did, I would not be attending. We all eventually settled on a stay at a beach house. I prefer that a lot more, wouldn't you? From one ghostly tale to another, this next story will leave you questioning what's real. I'm glad I left early for work. I tapped my fingers along the tattered steering wheel, trying perpetually to soothe my swirling mind. I'd always had heavy anxiety, and driving seemed to exacerbate it. Maybe, in this instance at least, it wouldn't be as much of a hindrance as I once thought it to be. The sun hadn't risen quite yet as I hopped and scooted along the various back roads to my workplace. I always tried like hell to avoid the main roads. The first few rays threaded up beyond the horizon, still mostly concealed by the canopy of withering oaks overhead. Twisting pavement crumbled at its edges, collapsing into the deep ditches that ran along the length of my route. A less seasoned traveler would surely miss the deep potholes beneath the dark morning's cloak. Despite the treacherous conditions, my old Yoda hardly missed a beat. It'd been my first and only truck ever since I'd begun driving, eating the horrible rookie mistakes that came with owning a manual vehicle. The frame rot would surely be its demise. My anxiety eased off as the beams of light finally chewed their way through the tree line's autumn-eaten limbs. Squirrels hopped and darted through the foliage, playing chicken with me as I slammed the brakes every so often, as to not turn them into a spot on the ground. I didn't mind having to stop for the things. It helped keep my tiresome mind at bay. Suddenly, a swath of light etched itself on the pavement which rounded my next turn. Another car. It wasn't a common sight on this lonely back road, and it was something that always got my gut in a twist. What if it was a cop? I hadn't renewed my tags or bothered with insurance since I'd found this new route. Kinda silly, right? Somebody as wound-tight as me couldn't bother with something so important. Silly. To say I was surprised when the car rounded that corner would be an understatement. It turned slowly, that silver Jeep that looked awfully similar to my wife's car. I studied it as it drew nearer. My heart dropped when I read the license plate. It was, in fact, my wife's Jeep. But what would she be doing heading back home this early in the morning? I knew she never took this route home, either. As I raised my hand to wave, I noticed something even more peculiar, something that made my heart sink further than I ever thought possible. Admittedly, the windows of her Jeep are tinted, but I swear I saw a man in the driver's seat. His face looked weird as we began to pass one another, his head turning as we made eye contact. That's when I realized he was wearing a mask. I slammed on the brakes, stopping dead in my tracks as I watched the car disappear beyond the oaks. I swear I hadn't seen her in the passenger seat. Maybe it was a family member borrowing her car? But why the hell wouldn't she tell me? And why would he be wearing a mask? No, that makes no sense. Could she be hiding something? Like another partner? Seemed unlikely, and still doesn't explain the mask part. I backed up and whipped my truck around, shutting the lights off so I could follow without being seen for as long as possible. The once jovial play of the squirrels and the green-brown mess of beauty around me seemed dull now as I followed loosely behind the man in my wife's car. The morning dark had washed away by then, and I could see the Jeep careening along the busted road through the barren foliage. Then, all at once, the Jeep began picking up speed. At first it was nearly imperceptible, but by the time I'd caught view of the vehicle again, I could see it nearly leaving the pavement as it bounced up and down the winding road. My old truck struggled to keep pace with the deranged driver in my wife's car, but I was determined to follow this bastard all the way to hell. By this point, I was pretty sure someone had either stolen her car or it was a full-blown kidnapping. Either way, I was hell-bent on catching him. I tailed him all the way down the back road until we'd passed by my house and were now nearing the highway. I swear I'd seen a moving truck sitting in my driveway. By then, he'd begun brake checking and swerving like a complete madman. Whoever this guy was, he was adamant about not getting caught. The foliage around us had become a blur as we sped closer and closer to the highway. I had to put an end to this chase, quickly. If he reached the highway, there's no way my old truck would be able to keep up. I guess I'd seen enough episodes of Cops to at least attempt a pit maneuver. The next time he brake checked me, instead of slowing down, I pressed onward, sliding beside the Jeep as my truck struggled to not slide into the cavernous ditch to my left. My heart was beating so fast, I could feel my vision beginning to blur as I jerked the wheel to the right, clipping the back corner of the Jeep. In an instant, my truck had been turned completely around as the squeal of burning rubber shattered the perfect morning quiet. Then, I heard a monstrous boom. Once I'd come to a halt, I hopped out of the cab and promptly twisted my ankle in one of those goddamned potholes. I'd later found out that I'd broken my ankle that way, but hadn't even felt the pain through the surge of adrenaline. I hobbled forward, making my way closer to my wife's overturned Jeep. The vehicle sat in a crumbled mess along the ditch, a thread of smoke reaching its gray tendrils towards the sky. The surrounding woods had grown eerily silent. The door to the Jeep squealed open as the masked man pushed his way out. His once white button-up shirt hung off his body in bloody ropes. The ski mask he wore was riddled with holes revealing patches of blonde hair which stuck out in different directions. His eyes were bloodshot and screamed insanity. "Look what you fucking did," he screamed, haphazardly raising a shotgun in my direction. The first shot rang out, blasting a hole in the windshield of my truck behind me. The second brought me back to reality, flying somewhere into the random thickets of brush. I ran back to my truck, flinging the door open as he reloaded the bullet that would surely kill me. Another blast rang out. This one ripped the mirror clean off my door. I braced myself, waiting for the next boom. From the depths of the smoldering Jeep, I could hear a faint scream. My wife's scream. I gritted my teeth and pulled myself back into the truck's cab, fumbling stupidly for the keys. The next bullet tore through my windshield and chewed a hole through the passenger seat. Yellow foam spewed from the smoking cavern it had left. "You're fucked." He sounded more like an animal, like a demon than a man. He was going to kill me. I could hear the scrape of footsteps grow closer as he reloaded the shotgun once more. Finally, I got the key jammed in the ignition and twisted it. The old Yoda came to life as I depressed the clutch and lurched forward, barreling straight for the man who had kidnapped my love, my life. His last shot missed entirely as I smashed into the masked man, sending him hurtling over the ditch and into a tree. My truck followed shortly thereafter, pinning his mangled body against the stout oak. The world went quiet and my adrenaline eased as I slipped into unconsciousness. Whatever fight I'd had left was gone upon reawakening. My vision seemed like one of those old cartoons where random holes of nothing permeated and out. My head screamed and my body agreed as the pain from my leg made moving an inch seem unbearable. But still, I persisted. I pushed the smashed-up door aside and slowly made my way back out. A great plume of smoke billowed from underneath the hood of my now-dead truck. Truthfully, despite what he had done, I was hesitant to see the gore that sat just out of view. I hobbled closer, nearing the grisly sight that awaited when a flash of white-hot pain screamed through my back. I fell to my knees. "You son of a bitch!" Sarah screamed. "You killed him!" She continued, pulling the knife from my back, ready to plunge it in once more until I turned over and met her gaze. Sarah, my love, my everything, was holding a knife that was now stained with my blood. Her eyes seemed both vicious and weepy all at once. She dropped the knife and backed away, blubbering quietly, repeating, "I loved him," over and over. She fell back, curling up on the shattered glass that littered the road. I wish I could say that I'd said or done something heroic, but in that moment, it seemed as though my mind had retreated to somewhere far, far away. By some sort of luck, or divine intervention if you believe in such things, a squad car happened upon the wreckage. Perhaps one of the houses tucked away on that back road had called in the commotion. I'm still not sure. Apparently, the guy's name was Scott, redacted, who had been one of my wife's work colleagues. They'd gotten romantically involved at some point, and he got her hooked on drugs. That morning, according to Sarah, they planned on coming to our house and killing me in my sleep. She must not have been listening when I told her I had a meeting before work that day and was going to be leaving early. I guess if she planned to kill me, then there was no point in listening to whatever it was I had to say. Oh well. Oddly, my driving anxiety seems to have lessened ever since the incident. Then again, everything seems pretty numb at this point. Either way, my wife will most likely be in prison for the rest of her life, which gives me plenty of time to think about what I'll say to her when I visit. The nightmare continues. Let's descend into the next story where the true horrors await. The cruise. Stop playing with my hair. I chided my younger brother Mark as he swung his body back and forth in utmost boredom, finding the perfect victim to keep his hands occupied. I was focused on my iridescent shell bracelet I'd picked up at one of the shops, trying to loosen the knot that was cutting off my circulation. We were waiting to board a week-long cruise that had snaked through the Norwegian fjords, a break from our usual quiet suburban holidays. This trip was different, a way to commemorate what my parents called their second life, now that Mark was about to start college and I was midway through my PhD. Mark didn't want to come, but the promise of breathtaking landscapes replete with snowy peaks viewed from the comfort of a heated cabin, and most importantly, without having to lift a finger, meant our parents eventually won. Looking around at the crowd, from newlyweds to recent graduates on their gap years, we really were the spitting image of the American nuclear family. A thick mist was setting in when we finally stepped onto the ship, where a photographer ushered us in front of a sterile blue backdrop. I wrapped my arms around my beaming parents, while my brother was slightly off to the side, flashing his dopey grin. Still looking at the camera, I leaned over and teased, "Think you'll brave the pool?" Mark's face soured as the flash went off. He couldn't swim. Or rather, he wouldn't after a freak accident when he was 7. No one saw it happen. We were at the beach, and he came back from the water with cuts running down the entire lower half of his body. Years of therapy and the slow but sure magic of time quelled the aquaphobia, but he never went into the water again. I think my parents were waiting for when he was ready to tell them what happened, but seeing his improvement in the sessions, they never pressed him, and no one spoke of it again. The ship had 2 massive heated outdoors pools, but with the biting cold and the sun setting around 3 p.m., I doubted anyone would use them. I didn't know it then, but those decks would become desolate, nearly frozen by nightfall. The trip was as serene as the cruise had sold it to be, with some hikes and city tours here and there, but most of our time was spent on board reveling in the festivities and never-ending smorgasbord. We learned about hygge from another family on board, and the crew certainly leaned into it, providing hot chocolate or glögg at every corner. Still, when the sun slipped past the horizon, something changed, and everyone would huddle together inside almost instinctively. Darkness swallowed the surroundings, and only the soft lapping of water could be heard. One afternoon after a nap, I woke up to a dark cabin with no sign of Mark. Glancing at my phone, I saw a text. Heard someone say we'd be able to see the northern lights tonight. Gone up to check. I made my way to the bathroom to freshen up and join him. Not long after, I heard the door open and slam shut. "Mark?" I called out. No response. I stepped out of the bathroom, my face falling when I saw him. He stood frozen with his back against the door, his body rigid. "What happened?" I started, but he raised his hands to his face, and I realized he was sobbing. Now concerned, I reached for the telephone to call our parents, but he looked up and said, "Don't. Tell me what's going on." "I don't know," his voice barely audible. "I went up the deck after texting you. There were a few people waiting to see the lights, but it was too cloudy, so we waited. Then it got cold and people started leaving. I was about to leave too, but then I heard music. That wasn't unusual. There was often bands playing on the ship at night. I thought I'd go to pass some time, but as I walked around the deck, the music never got louder than a faint hymn. That's when I realized the sound wasn't coming from the ship." My stomach dropped. We had left the nearest city hours ago. and the closest ships were mere lights in the distance. I looked out towards the water, he continued. At first I couldn't see anything, but then something moved. There was something bobbing just beneath the surface. Keep going, I pressed, the room suddenly turning colder. I didn't know what I was looking at, but then I saw it. There were two pitch-black pupils staring right at me, and then it smiled and I could see the rows of razor-sharp teeth, and it stared humming. He groaned. It's come back for me. I froze, my mind racing for answers, but it was too late and there was nowhere to go. I promised him we'd figure this out tomorrow. He said nothing, just climbed into his bed, sitting up and stared at the closet. At some point I fell asleep, until the phone rang. Mark's bed was empty and there was a note on the nightstand. Before I could read it, my mom's voice crackled through the receiver. Have you seen Mark? Someone just reported they saw someone jump off the ship. I looked down at the note. Gone for a quick dip. And then I saw the unmistakable trace of water leading from the door to the closet. The darkness doesn't rest, and neither should you. Our next story awaits. The Echoes of Willow Creek. In the summer of 2005, I was just 17, navigating the chaotic waters of adolescence. My friends Lee and Hayden were my constant companions, our bond forged in the fires of youthful recklessness. We lived in Willow Creek, a small town woven with legends of the paranormal, tales that echoed in the corners of our minds, igniting our imaginations. One sweltering evening, as we lounged on Lee's porch, he leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with mischief. You guys ever heard about the old Carrington house? I'd heard the stories, just like everyone else in town. It was a decrepit mansion at the end of a winding road, abandoned for decades. Rumors swirled about its past, strange lights at night, whispers carried on the wind, and the chilling mystery of the Carrington family, who had disappeared without a trace. We should check it out, Lee suggested, his voice laced with excitement. Against my better judgment, I nodded. Hayden, ever the adventurous spirit, was already on board. Armed with flashlights, a cheap camera, and an ill-fated sense of bravery, we set out toward the house, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the horizon. The trees seemed to lean closer as we walked, shadows twisting like fingers reaching for us. When we arrived, the Carrington house loomed ahead, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes staring into our souls. We exchanged nervous glances, but laughter quickly filled the air, a futile attempt to mask the tension. The door creaked open at our touch, revealing a dark corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly. Dust particles floated in our flashlight beams, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. As we stepped inside, a chill swept over me. It felt as if the air was alive, thick with anticipation. The walls, adorned with peeling wallpaper, whispered secrets that I couldn't quite grasp. This place is a dump, Hayden said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his bravado. We moved cautiously, exploring room after room, each filled with remnants of a past long forgotten, a shattered mirror, an empty cradle, and photographs of the Carrington family frozen in time. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. A soft sobbing. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it pierced the stillness like a knife. Did you hear that? I asked, my heart racing. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, and Hayden nodded slowly. It's probably just the wind. We decided to investigate the source of the sound. As we ascended the staircase, the air grew colder, the atmosphere thickening around us. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet, as if warning us to turn back. We found ourselves in a small room, its walls lined with dusty toys and an old rocking chair that creaked eerily. In the corner, a small figure sat, shrouded in shadows. My heart dropped as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a girl, no older than 10, with tangled hair and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Get away from her," Lee shouted, instinctively stepping back, but I couldn't move. The girl's presence was hauntingly familiar, a reflection of innocence trapped in despair. "They won't let me go," she continued, her voice trembling. "You have to help me." Suddenly, the room darkened, the shadows coiling around us like serpents. The air became suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "Run!" I shouted, breaking free from my paralysis. We stumbled back down the stairs, adrenaline pumping through our veins as we fled toward the front door. but it slammed shut just as we reached for the handle, trapping us inside. Panic surged through me as the girl's sobbing morphed into laughter, a chilling sound that echoed through the halls. "You shouldn't have come here," her voice transformed into something sinister. I banged on the door, desperation clawing at my throat. "Let us out." The house responded with an ominous rumble, the floor shaking beneath our feet. "We're not going to die here," Hayden yelled, pushing against the door. Just then, a blinding light flickered from the upstairs window, illuminating the silhouette of the girl, now grinning wide, her eyes gleaming with malice. We dashed through the living room, searching for any other way out. But every door we tried was locked, every window sealed tight. The shadows began to close in around us, whispering our names in a haunting chorus. "Stay with us. Join us. Stop it," Lee shouted, clutching his head as if trying to drown out the sound. "This is just a stupid game." But the house didn't play games. It thrived on fear. I felt it tightening around us, feeding off our terror. We huddled together in the corner of the living room, trying to devise a plan, but the darkness enveloped us, a suffocating blanket. Suddenly, I spotted the girl again, her figure now looming larger than life. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice echoing like a bell tolling in the night. "You can never leave." With a surge of anger and fear, I grabbed the camera from my bag. "I'll expose you," I yelled, pointing it at her. The flash illuminated her face, and for a split second, I saw her true form, a ghastly visage of despair, her smile wide and twisted. The room shook violently, and the shadows lunged at us. I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, pulling me down. "Help!" I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the darkness was relentless. Lee and Hayden grabbed my arms, trying to pull me back, but the force was too strong. As I was dragged deeper into the shadows, I caught a glimpse of the girl's face again, now contorted in rage. "You'll never escape. You're part of us now." Her laughter echoed in my ears, a sound that would haunt me forever. In a desperate final attempt, I closed my eyes and focused. "You don't own me," I screamed, fighting against the pull. In that moment of clarity, I remembered the stories, the children who had disappeared, their laughter now twisted into a curse. I will not be another victim. With a final surge of energy, I broke free from the darkness, launching myself toward my friends. We tumbled into the living room, gasping for breath. The shadows hissed in anger, retreating momentarily, but I knew they wouldn't give up so easily. "Go! Now!" I shouted, pushing Lee and Hayden toward the front door. We bolted for it, throwing our weight against the barrier. With a creak and a groan, the door finally gave way, and we stumbled into the cool night air, collapsing onto the grass. Gasping for breath, we looked back at the house, its silhouette towering ominously against the starry sky. The windows glowed faintly, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the girl standing there, her expression unreadable. "We need to get out of here," Hayden panted, and we scrambled to our feet, running down the path that led us away from the nightmare. As we reached the road, I glanced back one last time. The Carrington house loomed behind us, and in that moment, I felt a deep, suffocating melancholy wash over me. Even as we escaped, I knew the shadows hadn't been vanquished. They lingered in the corners of the house, waiting for the next unwitting souls to wander into their grasp. And the girl, the embodiment of all the lost innocence, would continue to cry out for help, a haunting echo that would reverberate through the town, binding her fate to those who dared to step inside. From that day on, the Carrington house became a ghost story, a tale of warning shared around campfires. But deep inside, I knew that its true terror lay not in the supernatural, but in the reminder of the fragility of life and the shadows that can swallow us whole, leaving nothing but echoes behind. From one haunting to the next, fear is a constant companion. Listen closely. I think my antidepressant medicine grew something inside of me. It's a new wonder, drug that just entered the market, or at least that's what the doctor on that online prescription service told me. You know the kind of service I'm talking about. The kind that gets advertised on YouTube ads all the time, or pops up in between commercial breaks of your favorite reality TV show. This one came to me the old-fashioned way, though. Slipped through the mail slot in my front door inconspicuously. Are you tired of feeling tired? Are you one of the millions of people suffering from crippling anxiety? Have trouble getting out of bed? Just plain sad? Go to care4u.com today to speak to a licensed physician and feel better faster. I've got to admit that I'm not one to usually fall for these kinds of things, but I've really been going through a rough patch in my mental health journey and was looking for a way to start feeling like myself again. I've always been an anxious person, even when having no reason to be, and it had gotten to a point where I was exhausted. The Zoloft, citalopram, hydroxyzine, nothing my primary care doctor prescribed did anything except make me nauseous. So what the heck? Might as well try whatever I can. The website looked modern enough, and the link to schedule a virtual meeting was easy to find, so I put in my email address, picked a time slot, and waited to receive an email confirming the appointment. I was told I would be meeting with a physician named Dr. Watkins. Seemed legit enough, and I was excited to try something new. When the time came, I received an email with a Zoom link and hopped on the call. A figure sitting behind a wide oak desk, wearing a sterile white doctor's coat, greeted me. I couldn't really make out his face, as the lighting in the room he was in was poor and only illuminated the bottom half of his figure. But even in the shadows, I could make out a smile populated with small white teeth. Sorry, the picture quality is poor. They're remodeling my office, and I'm forced to take meetings in my own house. I'm Dr. Watkins. No problem at all. Nice to meet you, and thank you for seeing me, I said cheerily. I was trying not to come across as awkward, but something was eerily unsettling about the environment he was portrayed in. So in the form you filled out, you mentioned you have been suffering from some severe anxiety and that the normal course of medicines hasn't been taking any effect. Can you? A voice somewhere distant in his surroundings interrupted him, and he quickly muted the sound on his end and got up from his desk, bumping his computer and shifting the image to a slightly different angle of the room. It was dirty. Clothes littered the floor, and it was obvious that he had just hauled some desk into the corner of his bedroom to take calls. It was kinda odd and made me begin to question his validity, but he quickly returned and apologized for the interruption. After speaking to him for some time and explaining my situation, I began to feel better, as he really seemed to know his stuff about other medications and procedures for dealing with depression and anxiety. I chalked the weird surroundings up to him getting booted out of his normal office and quickly having to make do at home. Eventually, he brought up this new wonder drug, as he described it. He was really excited about it and said it had significantly improved a majority of his clients' lives. It went by the commercial name of Calerio. I had never heard of it, but again, I was willing to try anything at this point. Dr. Watkins seemed very excited when I agreed to give the drug a try. His wide, tiny tooth-filled grin showed even more clear. When I tried to give him my pharmacy, he quickly noted that through care4u.com, he could directly ship the medication to my house. Seemed convenient, so I agreed. Gave him my address and ended the call, hopeful for something that might work. Before the call ended, he mentioned that I should try it for at least a week before I should stop taking it or worry about any initial side effects. He said some stomach pain was normal, and I was used to that with the other medicines I had tried. A few days later, a small package arrived at my doorstep, and when I opened it, I was greeted by a small orange pill bottle with my name on it and instructions for how to take the medicine. Take 2 pills a day with food. Seemed easy enough. I finished my morning coffee, toast with butter and eggs, and popped one of the small blue pills in my mouth and swallowed with a big gulp of water. I immediately felt a rumble in my stomach. It was a bit painful, but quickly subsided with some passing of gas. I thought I should maybe start going easy on the coffee. Morning flatulence concluded. I went about my day as normal. That night, I ate my dinner and took the second pill. More stomach disturbances, but nothing too crazy to be concerned about. Everything was normal until the 4th day of taking the new medication. I had been having stomach rumbles, but nothing that couldn't be attributed to excess coffee or my body getting used to the Calerio. What wasn't normal was the kick I felt in my stomach after taking my nightly dose. I had been sitting on the sofa watching TV when suddenly my abdomen jerked hard, and it felt like a small lump bounced against the inside of my stomach, almost like a baby kick. I hate thinking about it. It was pretty painful too. I remembered what Dr. Watkins said about the initial side effects and did my best to ignore it, going to bed and trying to sleep off the weirdness. The 5th day was the worst. I was bedridden most of the day, feeling more of those kicks and also constantly feeling full, like I had been eating massive meals even though I hadn't been able to get down any food. I thought enough was enough and tried to go on careforyou.com to schedule another meeting with Dr. Watkins to explain the situation and get some answers. The trouble was, the website seemingly didn't exist anymore. I searched every possible word combination I could think of, and after hours of scouring the internet, I couldn't find any trace that Care4You ever existed. I also tried looking up Dr. Watkins and found a ton of doctors that go by that name, but none with that wide, toothy smile I could remember so vividly. I knew I wasn't losing it either. I was alert and lucid because of the pain I was experiencing. I stopped taking the medication. It was getting late, and I decided to try to sleep and go see a real doctor in the morning, as something was clearly wrong. That night, I had the most intense nightmare I have ever experienced in my entire life. I dreamt I was floating inside a vast expanse of pitch black. I was weightless in the void, drifting slowly, the sound of my heart echoing like a drum. My stomach was expanding and contracting like a balloon being inflated just to the point of exploding and then shriveling back down to its measly, wrinkled, concave form. That's when I realized the drum sound wasn't my heart, but the sound of the kick, kick, kick inside my stomach. It grew louder and louder. My stomach expanded further and further. Eventually it burst, and some kind of light and energy poured out, and I awoke in a deep sweat. I wasn't in my bed. I was laying on the floor of my kitchen. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to check the time. That's when I noticed the empty pill bottle on the ground next to me. My heart sank. I looked at my phone and realized I had slept through the night and the next day as well. My stomach began hurting again. It was swelling up as well. I slapped myself to make sure I wasn't having one of those dreams inside of a dream. No good. I was definitely awake. As the swelling got worse, I ran to the bathroom. Now it felt like something was clawing at me inside of my stomach. I could feel individual fingernails scraping the inside of me. Little toes, elbows. I could feel the shape of something desperately trying to get out. I opened my mouth and a moaning sound came out. Not something that was being produced by my own vocal cords. I puked. I puked something out. I puked something out. It looked like some kind of large frog with small, human-like arms and legs. It was black and wet and had little bumps all over it. It looked up at me with human eyes. Not little black dots like frogs have, but human eyes with whites, pupils, irises, everything. It jumped out of the toilet, ran down the hall, and crashed out through an open window in the living room. I sat there in amazement and shock. I didn't know what to do. Do I call someone? Do I run? The strangest part of all, though, was that I felt better. Like way better. No more stomach pain and no internal trauma that I could feel. I rushed myself to the ER and told the nurses everything that had happened. They checked my vitals and did some scans, but everything looked normal. They also did a psych exam on me, and that came back normal as well. There were definite signs that I threw up, and everyone just assumed I must have had bad food poisoning. I mentioned the drug I was taking, and no one had heard of it. The nurse told me to stop taking it and to not trust any online physician again. When I got back home, the window was still broken, dissipating any suspicions I might have that I dreamt it. It took a few months for me to get over the shock. After that, though, I haven't experienced any anxiety or trauma. In fact, I'm the happiest I've ever been. My job is going great, I am extremely active and motivated, and I even am in a steady relationship. I still think about that thing sometimes, and who Dr. Watkins really was. Was I just a vehicle for something? Either way, I try to not ask many questions. I'm doing pretty good after all. Just when you think it's over, the shadows grow deeper. Let's step into the next story. Moonshine money. My grandpa used to tell me the best stories when he was alive. He grew up in the mountains and lived a very hard life. He had 8 other siblings, and they had to raise each other as his parents were gone often. One of the ways he helped provide was making moonshine. A man named Lucius helped my grandpa make corn liquor. They ran 2 stills at once and were extremely successful. Grandpa said they almost got caught a few times by Tennessee police, but never did. Grandpa said he kept the money on him and was able to help take care of his siblings. He said Lucius buried his in mason jars and would keep it hidden in the dirt. He knew where he hid it too. They had a good relationship and knew Grandpa wouldn't steal it from him. Lucius had no family and died before he could have kids. He said Lucius was driving a trunk load when some cops got behind him with sirens ablazing. He went too fast around a curve and the car flipped many times going down a mountain. Grandpa said he destroyed the stills and stopped making shine after that. He claims he didn't dig up the money because he was so filled with guilt. He became a Christian and tried to live an honest life. He said that money didn't belong to him. The property belonged to him and all his siblings, which became a headache when they'd all debate what to do with the land. There was 40 acres. It was deep in the woods. Grandpa wanted to donate the land, some wanted to sell, and some didn't. So nothing ever did get done ultimately. Grandma told them she didn't want anything to do with after he passed away. I would go up there occasionally to deer hunt and camp once in a blue moon. I had memories of him showing me the land and where the stills once were. He showed me a place nearby where the money supposedly was buried. He stacked a few rocks by a tree in that R. He also built a tiny cross and placed in the ground nearby as a tribute to Lucius. He used to scare me by saying that Lucius haunts the area. I made the decision that I was going to find out if it was truly there. I needed money for sure. The economy is terrible and cost of living isn't going down anytime soon. But I also just needed to know, I guess. Plus, all that money was doing was sitting there. I informed the two relatives that were still alive that I was going to go camping, and one gave me the key to the gate. I drove to it and let myself in. I had to drive across a tiny body of water before I could park my truck. Grandpa said he had to walk a mile from their rundown cabin to the edge of the road daily to get to the school bus. I put my .45 in my holster and carried along the trail after turning on my battery-powered lantern and grabbing a shovel. You never know if you'd see a coyote or a tweaker. Meth has become a real scary problem in this county. Finding the area wasn't too hard. What was scary was hearing the wind howl and seeing an occasional possum's eyes glowing back. I could have sworn I heard a voice saying, "Turn back." I found the cross that Grandpa built for his departed friend. There was a lot of ground to cover, so I began digging in every direction. I must have spent a good half hour looking and felt like giving up. That was until I hit something. I reached into the ground and moved more dirt with my hands until I felt the jar. I tugged until it made its way out. My ears began to ring and buzz aggressively. I felt wind push past my ear. I dropped the jar to cover them. I looked forward and seen something running at me. It was two dogs, but I could see through them. I stood up and seen a shotgun pointed at me with a man I could see through holding it. I fell down. "Stop right there. You ain't taking my money." It had to be Lucius. He was a young man wearing overalls and clean-shaved. One of the dogs ran to me and bit my leg. I tried hitting him with a rock, but my hand went straight through. My hand was freezing, as if I buried it in snow. "Back up, Blue," he commanded, and the dog returned to the owner. I placed my good hand on top of the dog bite that was now burning. I could see my jeans being stained by blood. "Please, please don't do this, Lucius," I begged as I took my hand to slowly reach for my pistol. I realized it wasn't going to do me any good anyway. "How do you know my name?" He lowered his shotgun. "I'm Jim's grandson." "Jim who?" "Your partner." "I'm sorry, I just needed the money." He stood quiet for what felt like an eternity. "Where is Jim?" He kept his gun at his side. "He passed away not too long ago. He talked about you to me often." He let out a smirk. "He was a crazy one, I tell you what. I reckon it's time I go see him." He reached into his overall pocket and pulled out a jar. "Drink this." But I drink or I shoot. The smell was strong. I swallowed a mouthful and it felt like my insides were on fire. It wasn't a normal liquor burn. I felt so much pain in my body. It felt as if my insides literally caught on fire. I woke up in my bed. My head was pounding something fierce. I looked down at my jeans and the stain was still there. I could feel the bite too. I managed to make it to the counter and swallow some Tylenol. I looked through my window to see my truck parked. I hobbled out and unlocked my door. The back seat was filled with dirty mason jars full of money. One horror behind us, another lies ahead. Dare you continue? The old man with a friendly face. The day was hot, roasting. The sky was a blazing bright light that shined above me. School time had come to an end, and I was making my way home. Passing through suburban streets, the sun seemed to lower even further, gleaming, burning my eyes. Heat immediately punctured my skin and forced me to remove my jumper. As I stuffed the jumper deep into my school bag, I noticed someone further along the street. Proceeding forward, not too far away from my house, I saw him. He helplessly stood, seeing off sweat that was dripping rapidly from his forehead. The man was small, although a lot taller than my 12-year-old self. He was small for a grown man. The closer I approached, the more I could come out through the summer air. He appeared old, having graying hair and wrinkly, leathery skin. His arms and legs were swarmed with varicose veins. Nearing the old man, he turned to me and smiled. A charming, innocent grin grew, and I gave one back. His face, smiling, he looked friendly, looked like a decent person. To go along with his jolliness, he had a huge hanging belly. He would make for a perfect cast as Santa Claus if he grew out his beard. I continued onward, approaching my house. Then I heard him desperately call out to me. "Oh dear," he said in a high-pitched tone, obligating my head to turn. "So sorry to bother, but can you help an old-timer out?" "Okay, what do?" Before I could even finish my sentence, the old man interrupted. "You see, I've managed to drop my only screwdriver down there, and I don't have the back in me anymore to reach down and grab it. Do you mind, dear?" "No, not at all," I replied. "Oh, thank you so much, dear. You see, it's quite far in there." He pointed with a crooked, yellow-stained finger to below the wide, white van that had only now revealed itself to me. I looked at him with an unintentional look of concern. He reassured me by saying, "Just down there," still pointing. I crouched down, touching the concrete ground, still keeping eye contact with the kind old man. He was licking his lips. Breaking my gaze, I poked my head in under the van. The surrounding lights still shined bright, but only darkness could be seen under. Shaded shadows surrounded me. The further I leaned inside, I couldn't see the screwdriver. I reached forward, attempting to grab something. Swaying my hand left and right, I only felt the thick, warm air. "Sorry, I can't see it." "I told you it's deep in there," he chuckled. Practically beneath the mammoth metallic van, claustrophobic and scared of the ever-growing blackness, I retreated back to the light. Crawling backward, I could only see 2 stumped legs. "I can't find it." There was no answer from the old man. "Mister, I'm scared." Still there was no answer. The back van door was pulled open like a train speeding past. Now I knew there was no screwdriver. The first thing he grabbed was my hair, tearing me out from underneath the van. My yelps of pain and panic were soon silenced as he put his gross, greasy hands over my mouth, pressing down on my nose, making it impossible to breathe. His other hand soon found my throat, and in one sporadic motion he threw me inside through the swinging back door of the van. Nothing was inside the van except me. No tools, no steps, no screwdriver or anything that a tradesman would use. Only me. I sat there trying to gather the air back into my lungs as the old man hurried inside the van, starting it. He sped off, heading straight forward. For a mere moment, reality stood still. I honestly had an outer-body experience commencing with myself. "Linda, he's taking you away from your family. Linda, he's going to hurt you. Linda, you're going to die if you don't do something. Linda, scream!" And that's exactly what I did. I screamed, roared at the top of my lungs, screeching, bursting eardrums, wailing, bagging the side of the van. I yelled for my freedom. Suddenly, not too long after I decided to have an outburst of shouts, the van came to a halt. He stopped the van in the middle of the road. He calmly slid the door open, letting in total sunshine. The friendly old man's face had become mean, cold, lifeless. I flew out the van, running away. He simply drove off, not speeding or driving like a maniac. He just drove off. This is where my memory becomes fuzzy. I must have made it back home, walking God knows how far. My mother tells me I came inside like nothing happened. I didn't talk for the whole day, and when this continued into the night, she knew something was wrong. She took me to the hospital that very night. I had torn my vocal cords and bruised my throat and lungs. As disturbing as it is, pain never felt so good. Next thing I can remember is writing on a piece of paper, answering the policeman's questions. I still don't know if they caught him. Today I am a 50-year-old woman with kids of my own. Nobody knows of this story besides me and my mom. I felt like if I shared this, or for better, put it out into the world, it would take this stain, this heavy weight of me. I'm not sure if it will. I guess we'll need to wait and see. But if there is anything to take away from this, I would say, when you see a friendly face, think to yourself, what's truly underneath it? One horror behind us, another lies ahead. Dare you continue? Don't go to New Orleans alone. A good couple of years ago, right about when the world seemed to be re-emerging from what seemed at the time an endless thoroughfare of liminality, I was called south for a brief business trip in New Orleans. Most co-workers had jointly planned to stay in one of the high-rising, unoffensively comfortable chain hotels in the downtown area, a notion that was absurd to me given the incomparable atmosphere of the colorfully cobbled inns of the historical French Quarter down below. So I abandoned the comfort of camaraderie, not a huge loss considering my affection for my co-workers ran slim, in favor of a lonesome, atmospheric jaunt through the dim quarter on the night before our meeting. I checked into my charming southern hotel, and after a delicious dinner of gumbo and a stroll down the darkening Mississippi, I figured what better way to end my night than by a good old New Orleans ghost tour. I did not believe in these tidbits of fascinating folklore, of course, but the history and imagination of it all was irresistible to me. A one-armed Iraq War veteran led the way through the quarter at night, narrating with both an amphetaminic excitement and dire pallor. He told of the mischievous spooks of the Andrew Jackson Hotel and the atrocities of the LaLaurie Mansion, but my ears really perked up when we came to my own hotel. He began by describing it in its initial state, a Civil War hospital, about as grim a bedrock for a horror story as you can get. He, however, stopped there and continued on to the next notable haunt on his itinerary. After the tour, I asked him why he went no further with my hotel. He told me blank and wide-eyed that the hotel had formally pressured the company organizing the tours to tread lightly in revealing its dark secrets, as it apparently correlated with a stark decline in incoming guests. Interesting to be sure, I thought cockily, showing my disappointment at the lack of gruesome details to this poor, whacked-out, likely deeply traumatized guy. I strode back to my hotel with confidence. However, once entering its musty interiors, I was struck by a sense of unease. My journey up to the room was met by the gnawing feeling that I would run into some ghastly, hacked-up soldier at every corner, if that was even the worst thing that this hotel had to offer. Even once safely in the room, the fear continued to grow, so I resolved to just leave the lights on through the night and put Simpsons reruns on the TV to lull me into an unlikely sleep. Ghosts don't haunt brightly lit rooms blaring 90s cartoons, right? I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I will never forget waking up. In what reason suggests it was that hotel room, but my senses betrayed to me as a black void in which light has never graced. Even the supposed bed I lie in felt less like a bed, more like a stiff board of oak. I felt an odd ache throughout my body that I could never determine as real or illusory. An urgent wakefulness came to me, and I glanced around like a madman, hoping to God that this darkness would end. Unfortunately, it did. Eventually, a small glow came from a spot in the distance that seemed many yards away. It approached, closer and closer. As it did, it registered to me as sort of this rocky orange orb, both dim and bright at the same time. Closer until I was face to face with it. There was a strange comfort I felt with this glow, as if it were some neutral cosmic entity that meant no harm. This meditative hypnosis was broken by a snort of smoke released around the orb, which smelled of sour tobacco. The orb suddenly lit up brightly with a hellish glare, revealing a large, absolutely terrible man leaning over my bed, directly in my face. The orb was merely the ashy end of a stubby, shit-like cigar, insignificantly sticking out of a head. That horrible, giant, godless dome with an infinitely rotting beard. Darting my glance away from this life-ruining sight was not much better, as this enormous brute wore a dusty apron stinking with visible blotches of blood, whose blood I could not say. In the apron's pockets were a slew of esoteric tools that I could not identify, either in name or purpose. What he held in his hands was more obvious, a butcher knife. The smell of tobacco would have been welcome relief to what was now an atmosphere of an ill-maintained slaughterhouse filling my nostrils. I decided this was quite enough, so, shutting my eyes first thing to avoid any more sights enough to ruin a man for 10 lifetimes over, stumbled over objects I couldn't place to where I knew the door was, crashing through, into the hall, down the stairs, and out to the street, where I still did not stop. I ran out of the quarter into the still bustling downtown area, into the Marriott, up to the room where thank God I knew one of my coworkers was staying. He let me in, and I made up a fairly realistic story of travel mishaps to explain why I lacked both room and luggage, my tired coworker nodding yawningly without much analysis. I spent the meeting next day staring at nothing in particular. When offered by coworkers to get drinks on Bourbon Street afterward, I respectfully declined, choosing to head straight for the airport to spend half a day staring down the runway, the benign cement giving me a slight comfort of nothingness in this mood of absolute dread. I have not been to New Orleans since, and only stay in high-rising, unoffensively comfortable chain hotels in downtown areas from now on. The chills are far from over, for another tale of dread is lurking in the dark. As good as dead, he'd been counting the days for years. The bruises had faded, but they lingered under his skin, like ink blots on a map of places he never wanted to go again. She'd make a comment, sharp as a broken bottle, and his stomach would twist. At night, her snoring rattled through the house while he lay still, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong, how it had all soured. Tim hadn't married her for love, not at first. Attraction, maybe. They'd met at a bar, her laugh pulling him in. She had a presence, a certain command of the room, and for someone like him, quiet, passive, it had felt like a shield. But over the years that shield turned into a weapon. The jokes weren't jokes anymore. They were tests. The little remarks about his paycheck, about how he left his shoes by the door, about how he couldn't stand up straight when she walked in, all of it mounted, piece by piece, year after year. The first time she hit him, he didn't react. Not really. His face burned, his heart raced, but his body froze. Then it happened again. A shove here, a slap there. And then the drinking got worse. She drank, he shut down. She belittled him, called him useless, a shell of a man, and after a while he started to believe it. But she hadn't killed him. Not yet. The night it happened, Tim hadn't planned it. The plan wasn't part of his nature. But the idea was there, creeping in the background for a long time, waiting. She had been screaming about some forgotten slight. He couldn't even remember what it was. And then came that look in her eyes. The one that meant something worse was coming. He saw her hand twitch, saw the familiar rise of her chest before the blow. But he didn't freeze this time. Something in him snapped. He grabbed the vase from the counter, a cheap thing, filled with flowers he hadn't bought for her, and brought it down on her head. Once, twice. Her body crumpled to the floor, eyes wide open but unseeing. He stood there, his breath coming in shallow gasps, waiting for her to move. But she didn't. The room felt too quiet without her voice, but it was a quiet that felt right. After, Tim cleaned up, as if he'd just spilled a drink. He wrapped her in a blanket, took her to the garage, and buried her beneath the garden out back. It wasn't some grand plan, but he knew no one would question him. No one ever did. People had seen the bruises, had heard her outbursts in public, but nobody ever asked. Not really. And if they had, he knew how to lie by then. When the police came, they asked about her, sure. He told them she'd left, that she'd been seeing someone else, probably took off in the night. They nodded, knowing the story already. The same one they'd heard too many times before. Suspicious, sure, but they had nothing on him. And so they left, and for the first time in years, Tim felt like he could breathe. In the months that followed, the guilt lingered, but it was manageable. He'd stand in the garden sometimes, looking at the fresh dirt, half expecting to hear her voice behind him, telling him to cut the grass or fix the fence. But the wind only blew, the house stayed still, and life went on. He didn't miss her, not really, but he missed what she'd stolen from him. The version of himself he had lost, the man he'd never been allowed to be. Then came the 5th anniversary. He had almost forgotten it until the package arrived. A wooden box, rough but finely crafted, nailed shut at the seams. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was some late wedding tradition. Maybe one of her sick jokes, something she'd planned before she died. But there, etched in the wood, was a single word. His name. Tim's hands shook as he pried it open. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a casket. Small, perfectly shaped, an unmistakable message. His heart raced as he stared at it, feeling the cold sweat rise on his back. Maybe she had known all along. Maybe she'd planned this herself. Some sick, twisted final laugh. A gift from beyond the grave, reminding him that he'd never really escape her. Even now, she still held the reins. Tim couldn't shake the feeling that the casket was watching him. He left it next to the kitchen table, trying not to look directly at it as he went about his day. It was only fit to his size, yet its presence swallowed the room whole, like a shadow growing long at dusk. He thought about throwing it away. Maybe it was just some morbid prank from one of her friends. She had enough of them, people who thrived on cruelty like she did. But there was something too personal about it. The way his full name was carved into the wood, the way it arrived on their anniversary, no one else would care to know those details. No one except her. Tim ran his hands through his hair, tugging at the roots. He could hear her voice again, the way she'd always taunted him when he was on edge. "What's wrong with you? Can't even take a joke?" It was that same tone he imagined now, tied to this damned thing on his kitchen floor. He left the room, trying to breathe. He walked through the house, each step heavy, each corner hiding a memory. There were still remnants of her everywhere. The kitchen, the living room, even their bedroom, where he hadn't been able to change the sheets. The whole house still felt like hers, no matter how hard he tried to make it his. He didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The casket was still in the kitchen, but its presence seemed to throb like a wound. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself it was all in his head. She was gone. He'd made sure of that. Buried her himself. There was no way she could be doing this. No way this was real. Then he heard the front door creak open. Tim sat up, his heart thudding hard against his chest. He stared at the doorway, listening to the soft shuffle of footsteps. At first, he told himself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, but the sound was too familiar, too rhythmic, like the way she used to drag her feet when she was coming in from the porch. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the room. Tim's breath caught in his throat as a figure stepped into the faint light. It was her. Her hair hung loose, wet and stringy, clinging to her pale skin. Her eyes were sunken, her lips pulled into that same twisted smirk she'd always worn when she knew she had the upper hand. But it was impossible. Tim had buried her. She couldn't be here. Yet there she stood, looking as solid and real as the floor beneath her. "Miss me, Tim?" she asked, her voice dark and sharp. Tim's mouth went dry. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Maybe he was going crazy. Maybe this was all a dream. "You thought you could just get rid of me?" she continued, stepping closer. "After everything we've been through, after all you've done," he finally found his voice, though it was weak, trembling. "You're dead. I buried you." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "You think you can bury the truth, Tim? You think you can bury me?" She leaned in, her breath hot against his face. "I'm not going anywhere." Tim backed away, stumbling over the coffee table. This isn't real. You're not real." "I am," she said, circling him like a predator. "You thought you could use me like I'm just a burden, some whore from the streets, and then put me in a hole, move on. I am your wife. Here we are, Tim." The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as her presence filled the space. He could smell her now, the same cheap perfume mixed with something rotten, something decayed. She was inches from him, her eyes locking onto his. "You can't have your cake and eat it too." She reached out, brushing a bony finger along his jaw. "No way." Tim shook his head, trying to break the spell. "I had no choice. You were killing me. Every day you were killing me." "Bullshit. And you think that your feelings and insecurities justify it? You think that makes you the victim?" She sneered, her face twisting with anger. "I made you better. I gave you a spine, and this is how you repay me?" Tim's chest tightened. He could barely breathe. You abused me." She laughed again, her voice echoing in his ears. I did not abuse you. Besides, do you think anyone's going to believe that? You think anyone would believe you over me? She stepped closer, her breath hot and sour. You're a pathetic man-child, Tim. Always have been. That's why you stayed with me, because I tried to make a man of you. That's why you'll never get to find something better. He felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, the years of torment and manipulation rushing back in waves. He had thought he was rid of her, thought he had finally escaped. But she was right. She still owned him. Even in death, she had her claws in him. Do you know what your problem is? She said, circling him. You never had the guts to stand up for yourself. That's why you needed me. You needed me to make you feel like a man. And when you couldn't handle it, you broke. You snapped. She stopped in front of him, crossing her arms. But you didn't finish the job, did you? You couldn't even do that right. Tim shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. I did. I buried you. You buried no one, she interrupted. You buried your guilt, your shame, that's all. His hands trembled as he backed up further, but she followed him, relentless. You want to get rid of me? You think you can? Go ahead, my husband. Put your hands around this throat. Try. But he couldn't. His legs buckled as the room tilted. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. She knelt beside him, her voice a venomous whisper in his ear. You'll never get rid of me, because deep down, you know you deserve this. And that's when she pointed to the casket. Get in, Tim. Tim stared at the casket, his pulse hammering in his ears. Every fiber of his body screamed at him to run, to get out of the house, to do anything but what she was asking. But he couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, his knees glued to the floor. Her presence weighed down on him, suffocating, as if the years of abuse had manifested into something physical, something inescapable. You don't have a choice, she whispered, leaning in close, her dry lips brushing his ear. You never did. You can't escape. You never could. He swallowed, his throat dry. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to me? Her laugh was high-pitched, cutting through his words. I'm being real with you. None of my family, our friends, they don't like you. I've tried to care for you, but you make me build up all of this resentment. She knelt beside him, her hand gripping his arm, forcing him to look at her. He tried to push past her, but she blocked his path, her hand pressing firmly on his chest. The years of this behavior, the gaslighting, the physical torment, had weakened him, broken him down. He knew it. She knew it. She leaned in close, feeling his chest. Get in the casket. His legs trembled. Please, he begged, his voice cracking. I didn't mean, get in. His body betrayed him, slowly turning toward the open casket. She stood over him, waiting, knowing he couldn't refuse her. He stumbled forward, his knees weak, and sat on the edge, wrath staring down into the dark velvet lining. His stomach twisted into knots, bile rising in his throat. Lie down, she said, her voice soft, almost kind. Make this easy. His body shook as he lowered himself into the casket, his mind screaming at him to stop, to fight back, to do something, anything, but he couldn't. The velvet was cold beneath his skin, and the space felt impossibly small, like it was closing in on him already. She hovered above him, her eyes gleaming, and then she pulled out the rope. No, he whispered, trying to sit up, but she was on him, her hands quick and strong. She pushed him back down, and before he could even shout, the thick rope was around his wrists, binding him tightly. Please don't do this. Shut up. She worked quickly, tying his legs, securing him in place. He tried to struggle, his wrists burning from the friction, but it was no use. She was methodical, precise, as if she had planned this moment for a long time. Next came the tape. You're such a baby, she sneered, pulling a roll of duct tape from her pocket. Always whining, crying. He tried to scream, but it was too late. She ripped off a strip of tape and slapped it across his mouth, sealing his lips shut. His breathing grew frantic, his chest heaving, but all he could manage were muffled, desperate grunts. There, she said, stepping back to admire her work. I am done with you. Tears welled in Tim's eyes as he thrashed helplessly, his body turning in the tight confines of the casket. But the bindings held fast, the ropes biting into his skin. He couldn't scream. He couldn't fight. He was trapped. She stood over him, smiling down with a cruel, bitter satisfaction. The lid of the casket loomed above him, and he shook his head wildly, trying to plead with her through the tape. But all that came out were muffled sounds. She ignored him. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the lid, sealing him in the dark. He could hear her outside, her voice muffled, but still cutting through the thick wood. You're gonna stay here and feel what it's like to be trapped, to be helpless, just like you made me feel. Tim kicked and thrashed, his fists pounding against the inside of the casket, but it wouldn't budge. Sweat dripped down his forehead, soaking his clothes as panic set in. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, stale, pressing down on him like a weight. Then he heard the voices. Others, people moving around outside, her friends, her family. Help, he tried to scream through the tape. Please. But the voices continued, casual, as if they were having a conversation. He could hear them laughing, the sound faint but unmistakable. They were all in on it. They knew. His breath caught in his throat as he felt the casket tilt. They were moving it, carrying it. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the sensation of being lifted, carried. He struggled again, kicking, hacked, screaming, but no one responded. The voices faded into the distance as they carried him out of the house, out to the garden. He could feel the chilly bite of the air through the casket as they set it down on the ground. Dirt fell, a faint rustling sound at first, then louder. It hit the casket in steady, rhythmic thuds, shaking him with jolts of terror. No, 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 no. He clawed at the lid, his fingers scraping against the wood. I didn't do this. I didn't. But the dirt kept coming, the weight of it pressing down on the casket, the sound growing louder, more final. His breath came in short, frantic gasps as the space around him seemed to shrink, the darkness closing in, tighter and tighter. You deserve this. Her voice echoed in his mind, even though she wasn't speaking anymore. You deserve everything. Tim's hands trembled as he pounded on the lid, his strength fading. The air was running out. His lungs burned, his heart raced, and still the dirt piled on, sealing him deeper beneath the earth. As the last of the dirt was packed in, everything went silent. Tim lay there, the darkness complete, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. All he could do was wait, trapped in the freezing, suffocating silence, alone with his guilt. Then it all became clear. The memory of her standing over him, the diary in her hands. His diary. The one he'd written in late at night when she was drunk, ranting and raving. The one where he'd sketched out an accidental murder in vivid detail, writing out his frustrations, his anger, his hate. The one he'd convinced himself was more than just a fantasy. But she had found it. She had read every word. The casket was her morbid gift. It wasn't some twisted joke from beyond the grave. She had never been dead. She had never even left. The life he thought he'd been living for months, the murder, the police, the freedom, all of it had been in his mind. An elaborate lie he'd told himself to cope with the fact that he couldn't stand up to her, that he could never escape her. And now here he was, buried, just like he had imagined doing to her. Only this time it wasn't his fantasy. It was her doing. She had dared to go that far, and no one would rescue him. No one could rescue him. It was too late. Tim lay there, trapped in the blackness, listening to the earth settling above him. The weight of it all crushed him slowly. He finally understood that he had been wrong all along. There was no escape for someone like him. Close one door and another creaks open. Ready for what's on the other side? Someone keeps on calling me. I don't know who or what. Ring, 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 ring. There it was, the sound of my phone going off at 3 in the damn morning. What the hell? I thought to myself in confusion and overall fear. Picking it up, I said down the line, "Who is this? What do you want? And why the hell are you calling so damn early?" No response. "Do you not hear me? Hello, is anyone fucking there?" No answer. But then, breathing. Lots and lots of breathing. Then a voice whispering on the other end. "Jaron, it is your time and you will find out in 10 minutes from now. Make sure to prepare." Then the phone hung up. The last word, prepare, was in a demonic, snarly voice. It gave me chills after that. What the fuck do they mean that it's my time and how the hell they know my name? I thought to myself. Again, ring, 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 ring. Picking it up, I asked this time, "Thomas, is that you? Pulling a stupid prank on me?" No response, but then, "Car crash at 3:23 a.m. The voice on the line responded now. "What do you fucking mean car crash? Please leave me the fuck alone. I can never leave you alone, Jaron. I am always with you." Then all of a sudden, I started to slip into a sleep state. Everything around me got black. and that's all I remembered until I woke up to the phone ringing again. Ring, 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 ring. But as I was going to answer it, I noticed the clock on the home screen of my phone showed that it was 3:21. Now, answering it in confusion and lots of fear, but also in awe in what the fuck happened to the time and how I was asleep for 20 minutes? In what felt like fucking 10 seconds. 1 minute and 30 seconds left, Jaren. The voice started yelling angrily, not whispering anymore. What the hell do you mean? I responded. 1 minute, 59 seconds, 58 seconds, 57, 56. The voice kept on counting down. Then the phone hung up a fucking gain. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise in the distance. It was the noise of what sounded like the sound of a tire screeching on the street. Then, I saw a bright light reflect from outside my window. I could make it out. It was headlights. It was coming towards me, then crash. And all I remember after that was my roof crumbling down on top of me and everything going black. What felt like an eternity, I woke up in a terrible sweat and feeling. It was just a horrible nightmare, a kind of dream within a dream type of nightmare. I said out loud to myself, breathing and calming myself down. Wow, what an awful nightmare though. Fuck. Checking my phone to see what time it was, the clock read 3:24 a.m. What a crazy coincidence, I thought to myself. But as I was thinking, that same fucking noise began to start up again. The noise that gives me goosebumps thinking about it. Ring, 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 ring. This time it was louder than before. Wait, this wasn't a fucking nightmare. What the actual fuck is going on? I started screaming out loud, trembling at fear. Picking it up, I yelled out the simple word, "Hello." I warned you, the voice at the other end said, each word being spoken with a second pause between each one. What do you mean? I responded back, voice shaking and trembling. A sigh at the other end was made into the phone and a response from this mystery voice, this mystery man. Then a response. Let us go on a little journey together, shall we? A journey into the place where the flowers wilt, where the trees burn, and where the ice caps melt. Then the phone hung up for the last and final. Suddenly I heard a loud knock outside of my door, and a voice was coming from the other side, a voice that was different than the one on the phone. Way different. The mystery voice said, "Afterlife Department, we just need to get a little information from you, sir. So now, let us in. The fear never ends, it simply takes a new form. Let's see what horrors come next. This is why I'm not afraid of the dark. My name is Allison Marshall, Alice for short, and I'm not afraid of the dark. I was around 11 to 12 when I found the old teddy bear under my bed. I was drawing and dropped my crayon between the gap. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. Bringing myself down to the ground, I shunned the light underneath to find a teddy bear lying next to my crayon. As soon as the light hit it, the bear sat up and looked at me. I gasped and turned the flashlight off while quickly getting back up on my feet. Doubting what I seen, I crouch and point the light back to the bear, who once again sat up and stared at me. Being a curious child, I experimented with the bear, who would only move in the light, didn't move at all when in the dark. I remember having little play dates with the teddy bear after my mother would go to sleep, bonding over the following days. Eventually, I adopted my newfound friend as Barry the bear. There was a particular game Barry liked to play, hide and seek, but instead of hiding to have me find him, Barry would collect certain objects like a doll, a jack-in-the-box, and a cymbal monkey. This game of hide-and-seek followed different rules. I turn the light off to let Barry wander in the dark. I count to 10 and turn the light on. I then make my guess to which toy Barry is currently behind. I pointed at the cymbal monkey, to which the jack-in-the-box popped out on its own. Light off then on. I pointed at the doll, to which the monkey started jumping. Light off and on. I pointed at the jack-in-the-box. It popped out, and I cheered victoriously. One night, I was too tired to play, so I went straight to sleep. The light in my mother's room came on, and the sound of glass breaking woke me up. I got up and went to go check on her. She stood there lifeless. I poked her arm to see if she was okay. She turned her head, revealing a wide, uncanny smile on her face, her eyes completely black. I stepped away and asked if she was all right. She pushed me into the hall and walked over to the drawers. I ran to my room and locked the door. I then sat in the darkest corner of my room and waited. Some time passed, and the house was completely silent. I quietly walked towards the door and peeked under it. A kitchen knife came swinging through the gap, sinking directly into my right eye. I screamed in horror and pulled away, my hand on my injured eye as blood rushed out. I used my free hand to open the window, then slid under my bed. I covered my mouth as my mother used the knife to slide past the lock and bursted the door wide open. A burning candle was shoved into her mouth as a light source. The wax melted away at her cheeks and chin. She headed to the window, and just as she peeked her head over, I came out from under the bed and pushed her. Her body fell down 4 stories and landed on the trash can below. I looked out the window once, then went to the living room to call 911. They showed up a few minutes later and took me to the hospital. Over the years, I went home to home and eventually grew out of foster care. I now work as a tattoo artist in the downtown area and live in a simple studio apartment. Several doctors offered me glass eyes, but I stuck with an eye patch as a reminder of that night. It took a while to get over my fear of light. I was paranoid for a long time and only stayed in dark areas, taking only the night shifts. But as I grew older and the more time I had to process, it finally came to me how Barry switched from toy to toy, possessing my mother. It was never the toys or my mother, it was their shadow. You survived the last story, but the true terror lies just ahead. Acne took over my neck, then my entire life. Did you know my eyes used to be brown? Before I start, I must beg of you one thing. Do not speculate about my identity. You already know who I am. If you have passed a radio in the local shops even once over the last decade, you've heard my voice. Perhaps you've been a rabid fan at my concerts. Perhaps you physically recoil at the sound of my lisp. Perhaps you're entirely neutral towards me. Love me or hate me, you know me. My situation is extremely unique, so it is difficult to anonymize my story. So please, if you can think of anything that may help me, share it. But keep my situation between us. Since I was a lad, I've been prone to acne, of all places, on the sides of my neck. My parents, my teachers, and the town's doctor swore up and down that it was hormonal, temporary. Once my growth spurt finished, they assured me it would be a thing of the past. The thing that annoyed me the most about this acne is that it never came to a head. No way to pop it and find relief in watching the pus ooze out, feeling it deflate. This didn't stop me from trying. I would struggle for what seemed like hours in the mirror, squeezing the hard bumps between my 2 forefingers in hopes that they'd burst. It never happened. Instead, my acne would only grow angrier, more inflamed when I tried. I would enter the bathroom with a neck speckled with small rosy bumps, visible only up close. I'd exit with what looked like huge welts, no closer to being popped than when I approached the mirror in the first place. My skin and ego would be bruised. So I learned to wear my hair long, to cover it up. When I was a younger teenager, it looked greasy, oafish. Though I will admit, I grew into the look quite a bit as time went on. The fairer sex took a liking to the sensitive, long-haired poet type I had become. My confidence increased exponentially as a result, thank God, but I would still come home to the bathroom mirror all the same. No matter how secure in myself I felt, the mirror was my grave reminder of my embarrassment of a neck. I must apologize for droning on about this topic for so long. It was a big deal in the way that acne is a big deal to teenagers. No one around me seemed to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. It didn't affect the one thing that was most important to me at the time: singing. I set up with my guitar around my tiny town, at first on the streets that weren't so crowded. A low-stakes test run, if you will. I'd opened my wee notebook to one of the dozens of poems I had set to a melody and bare my heart to the world. I loved the attention, and boy did I get a lot of it. At the end of those first performances, I'd find my guitar case overflowing with more than a couple of quid. With my confidence boosted, I'd then move to the town's main streets, as then the square. I was 17, about to go to uni, and I was doing about as well as one could do in our sleepy village. I was playing cafes, pubs, a party or two. It was beginning to look like an actual viable career option for me, much to my parents' chagrin. Eyes were on me now, a lot of eyes. If I chose to forego uni and take a shot at a musical career, that would mean even more eyes on me. And they wouldn't be as kind as my neighbors and friends. I knew my music and lyrics could stand the test of the most judgmental ear, but to be a singer, you must also, of course, look the part. As I was becoming a little local celebrity, my acne worsened. I was prescribed a slew of ointments and pills and dealt with the numerous side effects: dryness, itching, peeling, but no medicine made the slightest dent in the issue at hand. The hard bumps underneath the surface of my skin persisted. Eventually, I booked my first ever venue in the next village over. It was an actual concert venue, albeit a small one, and I was set to play as an opener for a local band. This would mean my biggest audience yet. Coincidentally, I also had my biggest acne flare yet at that time. One pustule, larger than the rest, was stationed threateningly close to the center of my neck. I would barely be able to cover it up with my hair. How I tortured myself for days before the event, praying to whatever God that would listen to, just let this one pop. I tried everything, sticking it with a needle, covering it with toothpaste, caking it with my mother's old concealer. The eyesore on my neck remained glaringly obvious. Finally, half an hour before the concert, the biggest one of my life so far, I gave it one last-ditch effort in the venue's bathroom mirror, and my dreams came true. The skin split and out leaked thick, gummy spurts of yellow-green pus. It must have drained for over 30 seconds from the small fissure in my skin. I am not above admitting I let out a moan of pleasure. The thing that I had been wanting to happen for a full decade finally happened. When it was spent, I wiped it clean with one of those rough brown paper towels from a dispenser on the wall, and there, on my neck, was an unmistakable green eye. The skin surrounding it looked doughy, false. It reminded me of the liquid latex I had applied to myself one Halloween to create the illusion of zombie skin sloughing off. But I touched it gingerly along the eye's lid, and I could feel that the skin was as sensitive as my eyelids. It was connected to my nerve endings. It was mine. The bright green eye, the exact color of the infected pus, stared back at me in the mirror. I was horrified, my breath suddenly ragged. The white of the eye was pinkish, the pupil dilated. It had sparse blondish lashes on either side of the crusty gash that was the lid. It quivered, alive, seeing. And after a moment, it blinked at me. I gasped and jumped back from the mirror. I was frozen. A knock came at the door, and the stagehand gave me a 5-minute warning. Said I was needed on stage. The eye was on the center right side of my neck. I looked back and forth between the bathroom door and the mirror. Another knock on the door, more urgent this time. At a loss for what to do, I pulled up my t-shirt up and around my neck, then buttoned up my jacket over it, creating the illusion of wearing a turtleneck. Yes, that's where my signature look came from, believe it or not. I digress. I exited the bathroom and made my way to the stage. It was my best set yet. I'll be honest, I don't know how I managed it. Though I was merely the opener, a position usually doomed to a half-hearted smattering of slow claps, I got extended applause at the end of almost every song. I could feel the reverberation of the music around the hall, the audience moving and reacting to my lyrics. I swear, even the headliner didn't get as much response. On any other night, my spirits would have soared. But clearly, I was a bit preoccupied. After the set, I rushed back to the bathroom to check my neck. I was hoping, praying that the eye was in my imagination, a result of pre-show jitters. But I pulled my makeshift turtleneck down, and there it was, blinking at me while nestled among my neck acne. I didn't have time to ponder too long. The bathroom door burst open, and I was dragged out into the crowd to celebrate by my cheering friends and family. My career took off quickly from that point. I was invited to play larger venues after the success of my first show. You must forgive my ego, but my talent only improved as I began to become the artist you know today. My lyrics became more poetic, tenfold. My melodies more hypnotic. I was just entering my 20s, and I was on the rise. Somehow, my concern about the eye took a back seat. Fame is all-encompassing, after all, and though the eye on the side of my neck was no longer my biggest concern, it was still there. It became a pre-show ritual in the restroom or green room or whatever back room to fiddle with my turtleneck until it concealed the problem to my satisfaction. I knew the eye still stared at me beneath whatever color of stretch cotton covered it up that day. I could feel it. I could never communicate with it. Yes, I did try to talk to it, like a madman. Blink thrice if you can understand me. So mortifying to admit, but it never blinked twice, let alone thrice. It followed movement occasionally, but infrequently enough that I was never sure if it was a coincidence or not. It was always trained on my bloody face. I was so used to having the countless eyes of a sea of concertgoers fixed on me, so eventually it didn't unsettle me quite the way it once had. One extra eye was nothing. My acne still hadn't cleared up either. But now I knew better than to test my luck by trying to pop anything else on my neck. As time passed, I was finally able to grow a substantial enough beard to cover up the problem entirely. I grew it longer and thicker to ensure there were no accidental peeks or slips or glances. And finally, after 3 years paying my dues opening for other bands and singers, it was time for me to be the headliner. It wasn't a small venue either, to my delight. More eyes than ever would be on me. Everything had to be flawless from now on. My performances, my appearances. I had to manage the absolute behemoth that my beard had become over the years. Right after I signed with my first manager, the first thing he said to me was that the caveman look wasn't easy to sell. Stick to the turtlenecks if I was that insecure about my acne. So I shaved, of course. I was careful, of course. Not careful enough. Of course. First, I reduced the massive beard to a manageable stubble with my clippers. And there, as always, was the eye, chartreuse in color and grotesquely blank. It had inched forth over time, directly to the right of my Adam's apple. I had then switched to a disposable razor to rid my face of the stubble completely. When I nicked my skin, I drew in a sharp breath. It felt like I hit another pustule, the same deep pain as the first time. Once again, sickly lime discharge streamed out as I held a washcloth to it, cursing myself in the mirror. I pulled away the cloth. There, on the center of my neck, 2 eyes stared back at me. One eye was an anomaly, something that maybe I could one day laugh at. I envisioned myself, down the road, being interviewed on a late-night show and sharing it with the host as a fun, freaky fact about myself, the way one does with an extra toe. It was a mere oddity, palatable. 2 eyes suggested something more sinister. The first eye looked at me, it always had, but 2 eyes moving in unison saw. It was at that moment I realized I was in danger. The eyes looked at me, judged me, wanted something from me. But they said nothing, barely blinked. Now that the eye had a twin, I realized how oddly enchanting they were. What was once waxy eyelid skin and repulsive lashes was now smooth, glowy. The infected pus-colored irises, alluring. They were beautiful, among the pockmarks and acne. Terrifying. It was then that my phone rang. I fumbled with it before being able to answer, but somehow I managed to pick up. My agent was on the other end, screaming. It sounded awful, painful. What? What? I asked the phone, increasingly panicked. Turns out it was excitement, not fear. My agent, a rookie like me, told me the label we'd been trying to get in contact with finally heard my EP and they wanted a meeting with me the next day. My superfans will know my rise to fame from there. Though it was swift, it wasn't very notable. Open for the right bands at the right venues at the right time, combined with some genius marketing promotion, mixed with a viral video or two. The perfect cocktail to fame. I went from a few thousand records sold to a few mil in the span of a year. Tickets that went for 20 quid at the beginning of my tour were being resold for hundreds by the end. You've probably heard this story about dozens of different artists. My story isn't very distinguishing from the outside perspective, but I lived in fear, constantly. The eyes never did anything but watch me, but that was enough. I knew the other shoe would drop sooner or later. Fame is all-encompassing, after all. After I'd get off the stage at my concerts, I'd run to the green room and check and recheck my turtleneck to make sure it hadn't revealed anything. I refused any and all interviews, made a name for myself as a notorious hermit who was rarely seen out on the town, never dated, barely left my flat. My agent hated it, my manager hated it, the label hated it. It would suit them better to have me act like a regular rock star, date actresses and models to fuel my fame. And as much as I'd love to be dating models too, my situation doesn't allow for it. All these eyes on me require absolute perfection on my part, and the eyes literally on me are anything but perfect. Any person close to me is a liability. My fan base loved my persona, though they obviously didn't know the full extent of it. But my loneliness lends itself to the lovely lyrics of pain, isolation, anguish that they just lap up. So I stayed home, rejected interviews, until one day my hand was forced. My label was concerned by my reclusion, worried that the bit would run thin. I was quite well known among the female 12 to 18 demographic, but pop stars can blink out in an instant. So they said to accept an exclusive interview on late night, or they'd drop me. I agreed, on the basis that I could grow my beard back before the event. They begrudgingly accepted my terms. And I did. They advertised, sensationalized, scandalized the interview for months beforehand. There were several Instagram accounts dedicated to counting down to the moment of my first public appearance ever. Posters on the tube, advertisements on YouTube. The nation's tweens waited with bated breath to know what I was like in conversation. So did I. You see, I had by this point grown quite worried. Years in social isolation does something to a person. Deteriorates his proclivity for interesting conversation. If I were to embarrass myself on late night, in a time where a man's failure could be nearly packaged and repurposed online for clickbait, it would be the end of me. Worse, I hadn't written any new music since the appearance of The Second Eye. I lived in a constant state of paranoia. It doesn't lend itself to composing. If the host asked me about my next project, I would fall flat. I started practicing conversation in the mirror with the only person I had readily available, myself. Luckily, I had another pair of eyes to stare into. I'd pin my beard to the sides and practice quips about my upbringing. Of course, I was my parents' favorite. I was an only child, and I swear they'd flash, approving. But more often than not, I'd fall flat, a frightful conversationalist, and they'd stare blankly. I was doomed. The months passed, and finally the night came. A half hour before I was set to go on the show, I was in the green room of the TV studio. I had gone around with the show's film crew trying slices of authentic New York pizza that afternoon, and they were screening the footage they had cut together for a segment on the program. It was deeply, heartbreakingly unfunny. For someone that writes songs that woo the masses, I couldn't string a sentence together for the life of me. You can tell the editors had pulled magic out of a hat to make me appear somewhat personable. My worst performance yet. I looked in the mirror, hating myself. I pulled my beard to the side and looked myself in the eyes. Please, I begged, I just need this to go well. The eyes looked at me, saw me, gave me what I wanted. I'm the mirror. I watched my other eyes close. It looked like they weren't there at all. Below them, a faint wrinkle, just above my collarbone, likely caused by years of looking down at my guitar, deepened. The skin pulled back into itself, creating a deep crevice extending across and into my neck. It looked as if my head and neck were detached at the shoulders, merely resting in a balance on them. The eyes reopened 3 inches above the wrinkle. Blinked. I felt a pull towards the crevice. Something told me exploring the fold would give me exactly what I was meant to have. I reached with both hands up to the split in my skin. I grabbed with my left fingers hooked into the lower half, and my right fingers in the upper portion, and pulled apart. The skin squelched and tore as my hands wrenched the crevice open. I tried to scream, but couldn't. When I moved my blood-soaked hands away, the 2 eyes on my neck had an accompanying perfectly formed mouth. Slightly darkened skin on the edges formed paper-thin lips, and just beyond them were fully developed teeth. A smooth, wet tongue. Again, I tried to scream, speak, anything, but it's as if my vocal cords no longer belonged to me. The green room was quiet now, but any moment a PA would be requesting my presence on stage. I could do nothing but look at my own reflection, at my new face, and wonder what the audience would think when they saw me. And then my new face moved, crept north toward my head. The eyes seemed to open new skin along my neck, with a slight tearing noise as they moved upward, the skin sealing up where they once had been. The mouth and the acne surrounding it pushed up as well. As this happened, my own face began to rise, to move back towards my hairline. I felt the skin at the base of my skull begin to fold in on itself as my face moved to the top of my head. I flailed, but I felt as if I wasn't in complete control of my own hands any longer. The new face reached its resting spot, where my face had once been. I stared up at the ceiling, my face now at the crown of my skull. My hands grabbed at my face, not the new one, and realized my nose had stayed where it was. My beard was now between my old and new faces, a makeshift sort of fringe across my forehead. It was a massive effort to even raise my hands for this long. I was at a complete loss for what to do, as I had been several times before. But now there was no covering up my hideous secret. Then came the inevitable knock on the door from the production assistant, willing to escort me to the stage. It sounded faint, far away. With the last of my strength, I brushed my hair over my face so it reached my beard and concealed me. My vision went dark, and I could hear nothing. I knew nothing of what happened on the show, not exactly. I woke up in bed, my face in its regular place, to an endless feed of texts singing praise for my appearance the night prior. According to them, I looked stunning. I was hilarious. I was charming. I was perfect. Not one message hinted that anything could have been amiss. I grabbed at a mirror on my nightstand. There, in the morning light, the face on my neck remained. I did watch the interview a few days later, after I had recovered from the shock of what happened. The messages were correct. I, or rather it, did stupendously. It recounted my childhood, painted the street busking it in a rosy light. It spoke about my acne problem, back when it was only an acne problem, as a relatable anecdote, cracked good-natured jokes with the host like it was nothing, played along with his games on screen, shook hands with, hugged members of the audience. It also hinted heavily at my next album, coming soon, and all the while, it was ruggedly handsome. The sickly green eyes were more of a golden hue on camera. The thin lips weren't an issue, as they wielded a charming grin. Even the acne looked good on it. It looked better than I had in years. My social media following had tripled. My inbox flooded. My streams were higher than I'd have dreamed of before, all in a few short days. I wondered what was next. I got my answer later that day, when after a brief call with my agent, I was set to start touring immediately. I would kick it off with a surprise performance that night, closing for the rock band performing at Madison Square Garden. I showed up in a limousine in a foul mood. Straight to the green room, turtleneck hitched up, talked to no one. I stared at the mirror, trying to hide my face from revealing the mix of anger and fear I felt. I knew what was coming, and I was having no more of it. I earned this performance, and I would perform, no matter what. I pulled a box cutter I had snuck in from my pocket at the same time as I yanked my turtleneck down. The face looked at the blade in my hand, and my world went dark. I again woke up in my hotel bed. I had no memory of what happened the previous night, or even what day it was. My phone was again flooded with messages praising my performance at the concert. One was from an unknown number. I opened it. "Hey, last night was so much fun. I still can't believe I got to meet you. I don't know why, but you told me to tell you this morning to check the drawer next to your bed." I did. Inside was a note scrawled in handwriting that was not mine. "Try that one more time, and I'll never let you up again. I'm helping you. Act like it." I was done ignoring the issue, and I wouldn't let this thing control me. I sprang out of bed and stomped to the kitchenette. I picked up a knife and again went dark. When I came to, it was nighttime, though I couldn't see that at first. I was surrounded by sky-high screens whose bright light hurt my eyes. I was in Times Square, and judging by the relatively sparse crowds, it must have been deep into the hours of the night. I was shirtless, pants half-zipped, with a crumpled piece of paper in one hand. I opened it up, and the scrawled handwriting read, "See how easily I can end you?" I looked around, afraid that someone had recognized me. I was definitely getting some looks, but I had the advantage of not being the only shirtless, crazed person there. I grabbed for my neck, realizing I had no turtleneck to cover me, and ran the 10 blocks back to my hotel. I opened my hotel room door to find a perfectly folded note on an end table. "Check your laptop." On it was an album, a new album, in my voice. 12 songs. Each was as beautiful as my early work, maybe better. I knew, if the world heard this, that would be it. I'd be cemented in history as one of the great singer-songwriters of my time. Within the folder on my desktop containing all the songs was a note, a text file labeled "README." "I can end your career as quickly as I can advance it. Play along like you've been doing, and we can both be happy. Don't try anything like that again." I barely cared about the text file. I didn't care about anything but that brilliant album. It would give me everything, and it did. One listen to that album, and I decided to take the face up on its offer. Let it do its work. That was a decade ago. For 10 full years, I've given it exactly what it wants. I haven't played a concert by myself in that time. I've barely made a public appearance, spoken to anyone outside my family. I have a wife now and a daughter who I only half know. It was slow at first. I'd let the other face only take over for public appearances, concerts, and the like, a few hours at a time. I think it exhausted the face to be in control for so long, as I'd always resurface feeling oddly drained. As I went on my first tour, then the second, it was in control for longer. It gave it power. I'd find hours missing from my day, hours where I wasn't in the public eye. When it began happening, I thought it was a fluke. It wasn't part of the deal. What would it want with my normal life? Then again, what was my normal life? That didn't seem to exist anymore. Everything I did, magazine interviews, songwriting coaching, vocal drills, endless hours at the gym, was for my career. No wonder the face was able to take over so easily. It's all for the public eye, all of it. It began happening more frequently, a night missing every month or so, nights when I wasn't on stage, nights when it should have remained beneath my beard, behind my turtleneck. Now, years later, it's in control most of the time. I get a few hours a day here and there to live my life in glimpses. I'm more famous, much more. So its power keeps growing. How can I possibly fight back? Any exercise of free will results in immediate consequences. I tried to play a concert once for my daughter's birthday, without letting the face take over. Not only did I lose consciousness immediately, I woke up to an extremely angry agent and record label and family over the apparent very public bender I had been on afterwards. I have no choice but to let it continue to take over. It gives me such wonderful things. I'm beloved by most. I have the fan base I had dreamed of as a child. I'm rich beyond imagination. I'm the perfect rock star. And I'm so lonely. There will come a time when I'm gone completely. Fame is all-encompassing, after all.